Bureau, John Austenberg, the mayor of Park Forest, Illinois, and he's also the chair of the the Chicago Southland Housing and Community Development Collaborative, which deals with housing issues in 45 cities in this area. And then Leon Rockingham, the mayor of North Chicago, Illinois, which is a very diverse suburban community here in Chicago. And we're really pleased that they were all, just make sure we touched on everyone. So as Jim said, Democracy Fund is the main sponsor of this conference. We really appreciate their financial support. They're doing a lot of good work around political polarization, and other folks. And then several units on campus also provided support. The Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, U Chicago Grad, and the Center for Identity and Inclusion, which has been fantastic to work with during this process. So, as representatives of those groups here, thank you a lot.
I think we can start.
Yeah, let's get started.
All right.
Thank you for the
What's that? Okay, yeah. All right, good morning, everybody. So it is my pleasure and my privilege to be running the Q&A with Ryan. If you haven't read his book, you should. It's a wonderful book with a fascinating subject. So how social geography affects our thinking and ultimately our voting. The book is so impressive in the number of disciplines that it covers and that it uses for its findings: psychology, field experiments, large data from political science. It's really impressive, just the range of techniques and analyses that the book has. And it's also beautifully written, which is quite rare for a work of political science. It's a real pleasure. I think that's probably a fair statement. It's also true for books by law professors. So I'm not counting my own field. The criticism also applies to legal works. So when I was before I became a professor, I used to attend these workshops at NYU where the presenter would start by summarizing the author's thesis for the author, and then asking the author what the presenter got right or got wrong. So if I had to summarize the book's thesis, it's that the spatial patterns of in-groups and out-groups directly affect people's attitudes toward out-groups. And then people's attitudes toward out-groups directly affect their voting behavior. So how likely they are to turn out, and what their actual vote choices are. And so maybe to simplify the book's central claim, it's that social geography directly affects cognition, and cognition in turn directly affects voting. So that's at least what I took to be the central claim, the central contribution of the book. So please tell me what I got right, what I got wrong in that understanding.
That was almost exactly right. I'll add one extension to that. Before I do, I just wanted to thank the organizers for letting me be part of this day today with such an impressive group of scholars, and it's a particular pleasure to be on something that graduate students have organized, because I always say that graduate students are really the most interested and smartest people in any department, so I'm sure this is no exception. So the fact that they decided to bring me in is a particular honor. So yes, this is correct. The only thing I would add is that the idea is that that social geography doesn't only affect what we think about the out group, but it actually affects what we think about the in group as well. It can make people feel that they're more part of the in group, and that affects our behavior as well. So I think that's a somewhat important distinction. And the only other extension I would give is that I think this extends beyond voting behavior. And part of it depends on how you define voting behavior, of course. But in the book, I talk about things like people's attitudes towards other groups and whether or not they will do things as simple as share with other groups. And I make and I speculate that it also affects even more radical behaviors, things like group violence and things like that. So in some ways, it shows the power of social geography that it can affect all these different types of political behavior beyond just voting behavior.
So I guess one might say that it affects voting behavior primarily, in a democracy where voting is the principal mechanism for exercising political influence. But where there are other mechanisms for exercising political influence, riots, violence, etc., social geography can also affect those mechanisms.
Yeah, that's right. And what I say is it affects people's behavior anywhere that groups come together. And so in a democracy, that can be where we come together at the ballot box, it can be where our representatives come together in legislatures and things like that. In non-democracies or even in democracies, it can affect things when we come together on the street. It can come when we come together in schools. It can come together in any of these institutions where groups have to meet and come together.
So the group, so the book includes a number of different aspects of social geography under that umbrella label. And so in particular, the book focuses on the size of outgroups, the spatial proximity of outgroups, and then the levels of residential segregation between in-groups and out-groups. And so I wondered, why are these the central aspects of geography that the book focuses on? I can imagine other elements of social geography, population density versus sparsity, levels of clustering of different groups, which is not exactly the same thing as residential segregation, and maybe also the particular spatial patterns in which groups live. Do you have a donut in the middle surrounded by a ring? Do you have stripes? The three categories of geography you look at don't exhaust the topic, I don't think.
They don't. I'd love to write a paper about the geography of donuts. I think that would be a good one to take next. And I think all those aspects could affect people's cognition, and in some ways I think they surely do, because one of the points I make in the book is that our cognition, our social cognition, is very tied to geography. It appears to be one of the fundamental ways that we understand the world, and there's reasons for this that evolutionary psychologists have given us. The reason that I focus on these three in particular is because I think that they draw on some powerful social psychological theory to explain social cognition. So in particular, psychologists have told us that the salience of groups, which affects how we behave towards groups, is a function of many different things, but in particular it can be a function of the accessibility of these group identities and how accessible a group is to us. Whether we think of this group when we see a person, do we think that person is a member of a racial category or a gender category or some low-level thing, we think of by their name or something like that. And this accessibility can be affected by two aspects of this geography. It can be affected by the size of the group. When something's bigger, it's just more accessible to us, we care about it more. When they're closer, the proximity of something, we care about it more as well. So those are these very basic psychological functions that are affected by those two aspects of geography. Another thing that psychologists tell us is they use this word comparative fit to say that the comparative fit of somebody in a group, basically the groupishness of a group, how well a group fits together, affects the salience of that group as well. And so that's where the segregation of groups come in. Essentially, when groups are divided, when they seem to be separated in space, our minds seem to use that as a heuristic or a shortcut to assume that those members of one group are more groupish than they might be if they were all mixed together. And therefore, that makes that group identity salient to us, and that affects our behavior downstream.
Great, and so you just mentioned the proximity of groups as being one of the aspects that you focus on. I think what's the most famous experiment in the book is an experiment about proximity. And so this is the study where Ryan had Mexican-American volunteers go stand on train platforms in the very white Boston suburbs, and then ride the trains from the suburbs into the city of Boston. And the result of just a few days of exposure to these Spanish-speaking Mexican-American volunteers was that a lot of the wealthy white commuters on the trains going into Boston began reporting more anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican attitudes. And so I think this is probably the study that's gotten maybe the most publicity from all the many interesting findings in the book. I just had a question. These are all people that are commuting into the city of Boston, where presumably they're exposed to a large degree of diversity as they go around the city. there might not be many Mexican Americans in the suburbs, but there are plenty of Mexican Americans, Asians, foreigners, all sorts of groups in the city itself. So what's so important about running into the Mexican American commuters, on the train near where people live, as opposed to just seeing diversity, in the city near one's workplace?
Sure. Well, the short answer is I'm not sure, but I have speculation on this. And in some ways, I think it shows the importance of social geography in a way, the importance of where people are, not just who they interact with. Because as Nick, of course, indicated, people are exposed or interact with people in different groups all the time. But it was something about putting these groups in this particular location, in this particular geographic location, that caused this effect that we saw. So on the one hand, it could be something about the fact that these putative immigrants were close to people's homes, that they were near where they lived. And psychologists talk about, and we can have an intuitive sense about this, that perhaps that's just more important, and it might be some sort of territoriality or something, and we care about what happens to our home. And that's what affects our attitudes more. And in some ways, one reason that could be important is perhaps when immigration becomes real for people, for natives in an area, when immigrants come in, it's not that they're somewhere working, but it's that they feel that those immigrants are starting to come into their home, into their neighborhood, or something like that. And that's what I was trying to simulate in that case, was that experience of immigration. Thinking about the book, I think the explanation that fits well with the book is this, going back to this idea of segregation and this idea of the comparative fit of a place, where when groups are all mixed together, when you go to downtown Boston, you see all these different groups and all these different languages, those distinctions aren't important because the comparative fit is low, as the psychologist would tell us, and you don't notice all these different individual groups. Everything just kind of becomes a mishmash. But when you're in a place where groups are very segregated, when they're very separate from each other, and those group distinctions are therefore important, once you raise the accessibility of those groups, because all of a sudden they're very close to you, then the salience of those groups gets very high. So it's that combination of this segregated environment with that newfound accessibility that I created by putting those groups in there that ramped up what appeared to be people's ethnocentrism and causes backlash against those groups.
And so I guess you would predict that if you ran a similar experiment but had the Mexican American volunteers hopping on a train for an intra-downtown Boston ride, you wouldn't see the same effects then.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Or they'd be so muted, they'd be really hard to detect. And I think a lot of us that live in cities, this is our experience. We get on the L, or in my case the T or whatever, every day, and we don't really notice all these different types of people that are on there. Occasionally, maybe we do if there's something very unusual going on, but it just sort of fades into our memory. But in this case, where they weren't used to seeing those people, that had a very distinct experience for them and seemed to affect their behavior.
And so you mentioned segregation, and so as I read the book, I had in the back of my mind another book on segregation that I've read and has had a big influence on me, which is Doug Massey and Nancy Denton's American Apartheid. And the main thesis of American Apartheid is that segregation has enormously negative social and economic consequences for the people that are living in the highly segregated areas. When you concentrate people that are below average in socioeconomic status, you end up intensifying all of their social and economic problems: poverty, unemployment, crime, poor health outcomes, etc. And so what I found interesting about Ryan's book is that that's not its focus. It shows us that segregation has other kinds of consequences, political consequences, and its effects aren't limited to the social and economic consequences that are the focus of Massey and Denton. And so I was wondering how we should think about the significance of those different kinds of consequences. Are you making a strong claim that these political effects are the ones that we really ought to focus on? Or is the book's claim just that we haven't noticed these political consequences yet, and they're important, but in no way should these political effects be understood as overshadowing what people like Massey and Denton have previously shown us?
Well, I would be very foolish to make a claim we should focus on what I say rather than Doug Massey. But that being said, I think that of course as political scientists, a lot of us in this room are, we can give some reason to think that this is something that we should pay attention to. And the complicated thing about the social world is, of course, all these things are mixed up. you know, that racial segregation can be important because not only does it lead to things like economic consequences and social consequences, but those in turn have effects on political behavior. And all these things are tied up in a way that I try to disentangle in the book. And I think that's one of the contributions of it. I try to sort of show the unique political aspects of this. One of the reasons, of course, that segregation, that racial segregation and other types of intergroup segregation might be so powerful, especially in the United States, is that it is also happens to coincide with economic segregation. And it seems to be that when these lines converge like that, when these intergroup boundaries, this is another thing that psychologists have told us, that when these intergroup boundaries converge like that, when you have groups that are not only racially segregated, but economically segregated, and they're distinct geographic parts of an area, that is something that's really going to make those groups salient. And what I show is that this has political consequences as well. Now, of course, the thing that can become important is that when it has political consequences, when it affects people's voting behavior, when it makes them more ethnocentric, that can then double down on further political outcomes that affect economic outcomes as well. It can do things like affect our support for welfare, our support for transferring wealth across school districts, for all kinds of things. And I think, therefore, these things are all tied up together, and we need to think about them in unison.
So you mentioned how with black-white segregation, at least, we have overlapping cleavages. We have a geographic cleavage, a racial cleavage, a class cleavage, also significant partisan and ideological cleavage. And so one nice contribution of the book, I think, is that it covers other kinds of pairs of groups where we don't have the same sorts of overlapping cleavages. So with blacks and Latinos in Los Angeles, for example, we don't have the same partisan and ideological contrast that we do between blacks and whites, or the same socioeconomic status differences. Likewise, with ultra-Orthodox and secular Jews in Israel, we actually have sort of the opposite cleavage in the U.S., where the group that affirmatively wants to be residentially clustered is the poorer, lower socioeconomic status and newer group. And so I was curious, to what extent are the book's claims affected or maybe become less powerful when we don't have the same set of overlapping cleavages that we do with blacks and whites in maybe the prototypical example of segregation?
To a certain extent, you might predict, for the reason that we just discussed, that some of these effects can be less powerful when you don't have all these cleavages that align, that things aren't segregated in all these different ways like we see in the United States in this black-white paradigm. Of course, one of the things I claim is that a central way we organize our world, in some ways the segregation that may matter the most, is this geographic segregation. And the fact that I can show this across these different groups where we see things like even outside the United States, and in this case, with a cleavage within a racial group or a religious group, we also saw patterns that look the same as they do in the United States when it comes to race. It maybe shows that geography really is this thing that drives a lot of our behavior. Now, political scientists, for the reasons that we're interested in this stuff, of course, focus a lot on things like power asymmetries between groups and resource asymmetries and how that contributes to things like intergroup attitudes. And those are going to be very important. And in some ways, that's why we focus so much on this black-white comparison in the United States. And there's been so much good work done on that. One thing I would say, though, and part of this has to do with changes in demography and just trying to expand our theories to beyond that particular important, yet in a certain respect, narrow paradigm, is it is interesting to examine other groups. And that's something I try to do in the book. And one of the things I say is that by our focus a lot of work I've done myself, by looking at this relationship between blacks and whites, and particularly the behavior of whites, we've missed a lot of the ways that geography can shape behavior. The example from Los Angeles is where I look at Latinos and blacks. And in some ways I'm looking at a situation here where the locally powerful group for a long time was African Americans that saw an immigration of Latinos into their neighborhoods. And that becomes interesting because the locally powerful group is no longer whites. But African Americans are a very different place in the social hierarchy than whites, and therefore do something that whites have not often done in this history, which is when an immigrant group shows up, they stay put. So you have these neighborhoods in Los Angeles where a group showed up, and the dominant group, in this case African Americans, didn't just take off to the suburbs, probably because they can't. And so therefore in that case, we get to see groups mix, and we get to see groups interact over a long period of time. And we get to see how that affects behavior, and it affects in some distinct ways. And in some ways, maybe we've missed that when we've looked at the black-white paradigm, or the white-anything paradigm, because sort of in US history, whenever other groups show up, whites kind of freak out and take off to the suburbs. And when that happens, we are experiencing that stark segregation that I write about a lot in the book, rather than these groups that are in more close proximity, like we see among Latinos and African Americans in Los Angeles, and in other cities as well.
And so I take the takeaway from that is sort of negative as well, that we have group biases and group polarization, not only in the black-white scenario, but even with lots of other kinds of group pairings, even when we don't have the same sorts of overlapping cleavages that we see with blacks and whites. So let me try to move to some maybe more hopeful terrain. So one clear sociological fact about the United States is that levels, at least of black-white residential segregation, are declining. They're not plummeting, but they've been steadily declining for 30 or 40 years. And meanwhile, levels of white Latino segregation are not increasing despite the exponential growth of the Latino population. And so I wonder, the book doesn't really talk about these sort of macro segregation trends. What should we make of them? I mean, why do you think these are happening within the theory of the book? Are they explicable, or are these sort of strange developments that the book can't really help us to understand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if they can be explained within the theory of the book, and of course, no one piece of scholarship should be able to explain everything. If it claims to, then there's probably something wrong with it. But I think it can speak to it in a way that's interesting. It can speak to some of the social trends we've seen recently. For example, I think something, and people in this room recognize this, that is a profound change in the United States, if it turns out to be stable, is the intergenerational shift in immigrant attitudes, where younger people seem to have a different perspective, or at least this is what we see in the standard survey questions we ask, a different perspective on or have different racial attitudes. And that could be a profound shift, where young white Americans, for example, feel different about minority groups than their parents did. And part of this could be this this long-term reduction in segregation, where these forces of segregation that I write about have not had the same effect on these younger generations. Now, I think one of the things that's interesting to think about is whether this is a particular moment in time, and whether we will see a shift towards something that will put us back in the situation that we were especially in the mid-20th century, with these high levels of segregation that seem to really affect people's group attitudes. There's a lot of churning in cities in the United States now, and we're seeing a resorting of low-status groups out to the suburbs, and a lot of rich white people moving into the inner cities. And if that happens, in some ways, and this is something I write about in the book as well, we may even be in a situation of more damaging racial geography than we had in the situation where you had this minority core of cities and white people living in the suburbs. And it'll be interesting to see in, let's say, 20 or 30 years, what level of segregation we fall on, whether we'll be back in a situation where segregation does not continue to decline, but is simply resorted. And I think if that happens, in many ways, the things that I write about in the book will even be worse.
Yeah, it's a good point that we've seen.
I know that was supposed to be hopeful. Sorry.
I think it's a fair and realistic point that just because we've seen a certain trend in segregation over a certain 30 or 40-year period, we can't just extrapolate this trend forward. Especially when the country is currently confronting the largest single wave of migration that it's ever had from a single area. You mentioned that we might be moving toward a new residential pattern where there could be the spatial isolation, presumably of minority groups and low socioeconomic status groups in the suburbs away from the city center. And it's interesting that if I think about the three main aspects of group geography that the book covers, then you would clearly have greater distance, less proximity between whites and blacks, whites and Latinos. And so wouldn't we expect that to be a good thing, right? Like if proximity is one of the drivers of group bias and group conflict, then shouldn't we expect a lessening of tension if in fact we get greater segregation but paired with suburbanization and sprawl, and so the different groups are very far away from one another?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and of course that's one of the tensions of the book, and it's actually something that people have brought up to me occasionally, where you can say one solution, and I put that in quotation marks, intergroup conflict could just be to totally isolate groups from each other, make them so separate they don't think about each other. And to a certain extent, I guess that would be true, but that for a lot of reasons, that's not something that we think is desirable in a lot of places a lot of us want to live. And it's not clear, what kind of solution that would be. It may also not even be possible, but it could be a social reality, of course, for these reasons we're talking about, that groups become more separate. But I think it's important to think about the consequences of that. Now, first of all, it's not clear over what distance this proximity matters. It could be that groups are, and this is sort of, if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the group, we see these, or the nitty-gritty of the book, we see these effects playing out over these large metropolitan areas, and it could be that you don't have to be so proximate. If you're so far, if a group's so far away, people probably forget about it, but you can sort of still be in the same really large area, and that group matters. We talked about this with, for example, people living in the distant suburbs of Chicago, where they probably rarely come into the city and see these minority groups that are so salient in their mind. But the fact that they're there and they're segregated, even just sort of distantly, seem to matter. We might imagine the same thing would happen if if the situation was simply reversed in terms of geography. The other thing, though, that's of course consequential is that one of the great anecdotes to segregation and to the effects it has is interpersonal contact, where people have contact with groups, with people from other groups interpersonally. And we might imagine the situation where you have low status minority groups living in the suburbs and all these white people living in the center of the city could make that even less likely to happen. Because, of course, with all the problems that U.S. racial geography has had over the last half century, one reality of it was that a lot of white people had to have contact with minorities because they still worked in cities. And so they would come into the neighborhood and they wanted to go to these cities because that's where all the stuff they liked was left. They had to come in there to go to cultural institutions, to go to sporting events, to work at their jobs, and all those kinds of things. And there's some reason to believe that even that kind of casual contact had an effect on people. Not only that, but they had a reason to care about cities. So, the examples I give, it's hard to imagine, even though some of them might have wanted to, it's hard to imagine all these people in downstate Illinois just to say we're going to forget about Chicago, even when Chicago was sort of at its lowest point in terms of economic power, in terms of things that made cities undesirable places to live in the late 20th century. They had to hold on to Chicago. It was for a lot of reasons. Same thing with Boston and Massachusetts and things like that. But imagine that situation's flipped, where now all of a sudden all the low status minorities are living in the suburbs. These high status whites have no reason to go out and have interpersonal contact with them. They have no reason to contribute to the economic well-being of those cities because they don't have the same sort of political and psychological connection. That's a very different situation. And we might imagine that situation could lead to a lot of very undesirable outcomes.
And so this points to how insoluble a lot of the problems identified by the book are. Right, so diversity is one driver of group conflict, but it's off the table to become a more homogeneous society. Greater distance between groups might have some positive effects, but there are good reasons not to pursue that policy either. At the extreme, we would surely oppose having tribal reservations for each group where never the twain shall meet. So that basically leaves residential segregation as a potential driver of improved group relations. If we could decrease the level of segregation, that's something that is an affirmative policy good. That doesn't involve a sacrifice of our liberal values. And so the book, it's not the book's job to do this, but there aren't many prescriptions in the book for how we might go about trying to reduce segregation. Do you have any ideas on that front? Is fair housing enforcement a solution? Is just the churn of the commercial marketplace a solution?
You mentioned one of them, and of course I try to, for good reason, shy away from policy in the book a bit, because policy's hard, and I shouldn't pretend that's an easy thing to do. There's reasons that other people do that. But I can offer thoughts, and one of them I talk about a bit, but I talk about a lot more after I've written the book, because people ask about this, is things about fair housing. Because, of course, cities, there's a reason we're seeing this churning in cities now, where the groups that are living here are changing, is because cities are becoming more and more expensive places to live, especially certain cities. And as that happens, we're seeing segregation increase, actually, and by certain metrics. And we're at that weird point we talked about where it's sort of been stable, but it could be going back the other direction. And so making cities places people can afford to live is going to have a lot of effects on the racial and other group mixing in those cities, making sure that everybody can afford to live there. So I think that's a very important anecdote to it. One thing I do say in the book is that, you know, as much as we've talked about segregation in the United States, we really sort of dance around the edge of issues. We try to do things like integrate our society through certain institutions like universities and businesses, and we used to do it through schools, so we don't even really do that anymore. And so that's really only touching a very small segment of society. And if we want to take this on, we do have to do something we're not used to doing in the United States, which is think about how we can tackle residential segregation. And in a certain word, I'll use the word force, which is not a word that we like to hear a lot in the United States when it comes to people's residency. But think about ways to force, or at least strongly encourage groups to live together, because I think it's really important for our long-term harmony.
So it does seem like if we're going to tackle segregation, it's in large part a governmentally driven phenomenon, right? Like much of the residential segregation in the U.S. right now is not spontaneous. It's the result of any number of deliberate policies implemented over many years. And so it's likely that to reduce segregation would also take, you know, collective governmental action. But there's an irony here in that efforts to reduce segregation face fierce resistance. You know, if you ideas for greater use of housing vouchers or building low-rise public housing in a more scattered fashion around the city. You know, even in the most liberal, most progressive areas of American metropolitan areas, those sorts of policy proposals are fiercely resisted. So even if academics could design some feasible policies, is there any chance to actually get any of them enacted, given the political dynamics of segregation?
Yeah, well, I feel like this session is just going to be such a downer. One of the messages from the book is of course, that this is hard. Now, there's people that have done great work on, you know, Clayton talks about working on this now about, in a very real way, about the politics of NIMBYism, which is tied up in race. Part of it may be separate from race, but it is tied up in race. And there's those aspects of it that are there that are hard to overcome. And one of the messages from the book, of course, is that segregation is a particularly hard nut to crack, if you will, because of these forces that I show, where once segregation exists for government policies, for all kinds of other reasons, it tends to give people attitudes and makes them vote in a way that makes them unlikely to undo that segregation. And so they're electing people that don't want to undo that segregation. And that makes it very difficult to get around. It seems to do better, you know, this is a very sort of general statement, but there seems to be places in the United States that do better with this than others. And one thing to look at, and I think this would be the next step of the study, is to ask what is it about those places? What is it about the institutional setup? What is it about the populations that live there that allow them to overcome these forces of segregation that affect their attitudes in a way that other places don't? If you want to make it even more general, there's other societies that are very different than the United States, but there's other societies that do much more radical things to overcome intergroup segregation. And we can ask ourselves whether the United States is one to adopt those types of things. Probably not. But we could ask whether those can be examples for whether certain localities, in a lot of ways we say that cities in some ways are these sort of laboratories of democracy now, especially when it comes to liberal policies. We could ask whether these are something that can happen, whether cities can take examples for those places and think about how they can overcome segregation locally.
Yeah, I just mentioned one policy idea I was reading about recently. So the U.S. currently does have public housing or rent assistance vouchers under Section 8, I think. But these are only available to a very small percentage of tenants that are qualified for the vouchers by virtue of their income. And so it wouldn't take that much federal money in order to give everyone a voucher who is qualified for it by income. You know, we'd be talking about a total federal expenditure in the order of $50 billion a year. Not pennies, but not a war in Iraq either. Not a tax cut for the wealthy either in terms of its expense. So that's one idea that I think has been shown to have some real effectiveness in reducing segregation. So I could go on with more questions of my own, but I think I've asked enough. So why don't we open it up to the audience to ask questions of Ryan?
Yes.
Is there
Thanks so much.
This means you really have to ask a question.
I know. I find this really fascinating, and I just have a question. I'm curious about how you think about solutions that perhaps are not so direct on the problem. So, for example, one of the reasons, besides in-group out-group antagonism, right, like just plain racial antagonism, that people are so resistant to desegregating residences is because of the political economy of housing, meaning most people have most of their wealth in their houses, and the idea that integrating with socially non-desirable groups, minorities, will bring down the value of those houses is really just terrifying, right? For a lot of people, especially if you live in a really high tax, high value market. Like I'm kind of in New York right now, right? So your house is where all, unless you're rich, right, where everything you have is. So I'm wondering about other kinds of social policies that take some of the pressure off of the political economy and housing, right? So if you think about universal health care, if you think about free college, if you think about, you see what I'm saying? That sort of relieves some of that pressure so that there might be more room to experiment, right? And making the argument in that way.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting, really interesting question. And where I thought you were going was just about things like encouraging mixed income housing. At Harvard, I raised this as the solution once to these problems in a seminar with Bob Putnam, and Bob Putnam said that that will never work because it kills social capital. And mixed income housing this was, and I started to object. And he said, and I can say this because the reason we have mixed income housing is because what if I wrote 30 years ago? And so, I felt at that point I couldn't argue with it long. Nevertheless, I think what you're pointing to in that respect is a lot easier to think about because people do have these ties to their housing in a way that makes it hard enough to crack, and it's an interesting solution. The only thing I would say about that is, for whatever reason, and there's people in this room that study this too, social welfare of all types in the United States is something that seems very impractical, especially in the current political climate. Any social welfare probably maybe can help with this problem, but it seems like any particular one is particularly difficult to implement right now. If they come, they might solve a lot of problems, but I think it could help with this problem in particular, or this problem as well, but there seem to be hard to implement.
I'll speak last one. Ryan, you have a lot of courage. You're tackling an area of research that there's about 70 years of social science research in. And, thanks. Okay, I'll do this again. One of the things that's always bedeviled researchers into the subject, going back to Gordon Alport, the key, this issue of causality. And whereas we know that segregation seems to have a relationship with racial attitudes and with political outcomes, but the question is are racial attitudes driving segregation patterns, or political processes driving segregation patterns? These things are out of tangle. One thing I really like about the book and about your research in general is you do a lot of very audacious experiments to try to sort of tease out some kind of causality. But I want to push you a little bit on this because these experimental methods might allow us to make some inferences of causality, but how do we still tangle through this? So where do you see your contributions in trying to sort through these causal mechanisms? How much confidence do you have that you're identifying some crucial linchpin in this causal thicket between where people live, the political processes that they exist in, and the racial priors?
So that's a great question. And Eric Oliver is a really good person to ask this question because he's contributed a lot to that 70 years of research that he's talking about. Some of the first times I started thinking about this work was reading his when I was in graduate school and thinking about these problems. And one of the things that drove me a little bit was thinking about these causal problems he was talking about. And so I know most people in the room haven't read the book, but one of the things I deal with in the book is ways to try to look for the causal effect of segregation. There's these different aspects of geography I deal with. One would be the size and proximity of the group. And for example, the experiment Nick asked about was a way to try to get causal leverage on that by putting people in people's neighborhoods and ramping up their proximity. Segregation is a hard thing to think about experimenting on. There's things that I do a little bit in the book where we can think about using things like instrumental variables for segregation, but I do actually try to do some experiments where we try to do things like create segregation in the laboratory, where we actually change people's spatial arrangement in the laboratory and see if that affects people's behavior. And it turns out it does, that by moving people around the laboratory, creating segregation, you can affect behavior. Now, the thing is, and this is what I think Eric's getting at, is this was in the laboratory, and what does that tell us about this complex social world where there's a lot of other stuff going on? Just because I can do something in a laboratory, does it really inform us about these much more complicated social and political processes of segregation and attitudes and politics? And I'm not going to. That's a really good question, and I can't claim for sure that what I do in the laboratory should speak to this problem, should speak to these larger things in a way that everybody would find convincing. I think what I try to do in the book is to triangulate from a lot of different types of evidence and say that this is what that this looks like. I'm identifying something that speaks to the larger social world. But that really is the most I can offer. And where I leave it is this is what I tell my graduate students all the time, that social science is hard. That we can run the experiments I should put like in quotation marks, we'd like to run, which is where we pick up whole cities and rearrange our segregation and see how people behave. But that one's not possible. So we have to do the best we can with these. The fun part about it that's left over is you have these moments of great interpretation where we can only say that what happens in a laboratory does it or does it not speak to this larger world. But I'll give one pitch for why I think it does to answer your question more directly, rather than just speak about generalities about how tough social science is. I think, for example, this particular experiment I do where I divide groups for a mere 5 minutes, these arbitrary groups, I divide them for 5 minutes in the laboratory. We do some other experiments on segregation too, but in some ways I think this is the most meaningful. We divide these arbitrary groups in the laboratory in a segregated way, and then we have an integrated condition where we don't. And we show that effect of segregation even does things like affects people's costly behavior, that they're less likely to share with groups when they're segregated using real money. And so the way I extrapolate that to the real world is I say that what we had here is we had these meaningless groups that were really just made up out of thin air, and they were left in a segregated situation for a mere 5 minutes, and that had real measurable effects on real costly behavior. And so what I can ask then is when we're in the larger world where we have this segregation that is permanent, where we have this segregation that has real meaningful social distinctions that go with it around race or around religion or whatever, I think we can then extrapolate somewhat safely to say that permanent, meaningful segregation might have effects on people's behavior in the real world.
Hi, just a quick question on demographics. I think the estimate now is that by 2042, people who currently identify as white will now be the minority in the United States, and I wonder how it's changing demographics. It's going to affect this issue of segregation and polarization. And secondly, with the increase of interracial coupling and individuals who identify as mixed race, what effect that might have. And finally, what about Asian Americans? What's their situation in all of this?
Yeah, okay, so let me see. Let me see if I can go through them one at a time. So yeah, so this question of changing demographics is really important, and one of the reasons I do things like this experiment in Boston on the trains, where I'm introducing people to immigration, is to ask what will the effect of that be, and whether places like whether there will be an effect in places like Boston of immigration in the same way we believe maybe there's an effect in places like Arizona, where we see these very fraught politics around immigration in Arizona. Is that something particular about Arizona, or will the whole United States be that way? Will these good liberal places like Boston be that way when they experience immigration? And it looks in the same way that Arizona has, and it looks like the answer may be yes. And that's why if you extrapolate out to the United States in about 20 years, 30 years, it should have a similar demographic balance to Arizona. And you might say this whole place will be very fraught. We'll have these fraught politics. that's something we should prepare for as a society, and then ask what can we do besides just sitting tight and assuming this is an issue for some places, not others. What can we do about changing attitudes beforehand to try and catch up with that? Because the prediction from the book is that as the size of an outgroup grows, so if this is the Latino population growing, that this Anglo population should freak out even more. They should have more of a backlash because the size of that outgroup is getting larger. And so it's a real issue that the United States has to prepare for to see if we're going to have harmonious politics. That was question number one. Oh yeah, interracial coupling. Yeah, that's interesting. One of the and it could lead to some of these changes that I talked about, where we see these changes generationally about the racial attitudes. That could be part of it. I think that there's an interesting discussion to be had about how much that's going to be a long-term trend, or whether it's in growth of interracial coupling, or whether it's something that's just more of a stable phenomenon for a certain segment of the population. A very interesting thing to think about is what happens to people's identities over time. And for example, especially as the Latino minority becomes a larger and larger portion of the United States, will people that currently identify as Latino still be Latino, let's say 2 or 3 generations from now, at least within the same family? And I don't think we have a super great handle on that as social scientists, but I think there's a lot of reason to believe that these paradigms we've used in the past were things that for a lot of reasons have been very stable identities, like whether somebody's African American, aren't going to apply to the Latino group in the same way. We need to think about that. Asian Americans, so that's really interesting. By my theories, often we think of Asian Americans as a group, and perhaps it speaks to why Asian Americans are not something that people that study race deal with as much, is because they're often a small group in a lot of places in the United States, and are therefore not as salient as they are in other places, or not as salient as other groups, and that would be predicted by my theory. But I think that you can point to anecdotes that are really interesting that fit the paradigm of my theory, where Asian Americans are a large, concentrated group. For example, in a lot of cities, there's areas like this in Chicago, but especially in the West Coast, like in Los Angeles. If you look at places like Koreatown, which is actually much more integrated. A long time ago, there was a very thriving Japantown in Little Tokyo, as they call it now, in Los Angeles. And you saw a lot of hostility towards the geographically centered around these parts of the United States, or around those parts of the cities that fit the paradigm of the book. And like a lot of groups, as Asian Americans become a larger and larger portion of the population, we might imagine that these same sort of backlash that we've seen in U.S. history at times, and see now against other groups, might happen against Asian Americans as well. Good question.
You guys touched on this a little bit in your conversation. I think, Ryan, you also talked about it in broader terms, maybe in terms of your book. But can you talk about what levels of how far the proximity variable extends? So obviously you were talking primarily in metropolitan, but would you expect someone in this to be playing out, if you live in downstate Illinois in the way to view Chicago, or someone who lives in the Midwest in the way to view the West Coast? What's the scale at which the proximity variable is?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and the truth is, which is the truth of a lot of things that I don't exactly know, but I'd like to think about ways to find out. Now, in certain particular cases, you can measure proximity, the sort of effect of proximity, very exactly. And I can see this, for example, in work I described in the book, that some of you might know about sort of these changes in voting behavior when public housing was changed in Chicago, and you saw this big removal of the African American population in certain neighborhoods. You can look at changes in voting behavior in a way that changed very precipitously with geography and with distance. And that seems like this very strong effect of proximity. You can see it in other places as well. And I'm doing some recent work where you can see it in other places. But you get this idea, but whether that applies to all situations, I don't know, because one of the things I talk about in the book is that these variables interact with each other. So we might imagine a really big group will be salient at a very far distance in a way that a very small group will not be. And that kind of intuitively makes sense, I think. And so a lot of the observational work I do in the book plays out in the metropolitan statistical area, where we look at these core-based statistical areas and look at their level of segregation and see how that affects things. And if that's a really meaningful thing in people's heads, then I think it kind of is, because we often, people say they live in Chicago, and people live in the suburbs of Chicago or care about what goes on in the center of Chicago, and they kind of care about what goes on in the further suburbs. Those are actually really big areas. We have this like liberal core in Chicago, and then we have people that are out in what places that we might describe downstate Illinois that are, frankly seem very rural to us here, but they're still part of the core-based statistical area of Chicago. You might think that's so far, they don't care about what's going on in Chicago, but I kind of think they do. So, if you hang out in rural areas, people talk a lot about what's going on in cities, and a lot of their sort of political orientation is vis-a-vis that city and how that city is different from them. And I think that part of that is them reacting to that difference in demography, that racial group that's there that's different from them, the fact that it's really big and kind of close, but not so close that they have to touch it every day. And now, of course, if you go far further away, and this is what you're asking, how far away do you have to go before they stop caring about them? That is just out of sight, out of mind. And I don't really know the answer to that. So, I think you get far enough away because the way the United States is the geography of the United States, you pick up another group. Like my relatives in Montana are very concerned about Indian reservations, for example. And this is they say watch out for the Blackfeet reservation. You're going up there, and they have all these stereotypes attached to that Indian reservation in a way that are very familiar with the stereotypes of people attached to the inner cities in urban areas. And so I think that a lot of that's the same phenomenon playing, a segregated, concentrated group that's kind of far away, that's close enough that they can have that they pick up on it and react to it psychologically. That's kind of far. So I don't know the answer. And then if you want to speculate even further, these groups get really big and really distinct, like between nations. And so I talk about this a little bit in the closing of the book, where you have a border and a really segregated group between Mexico and the United States. That I think that affects people's psychology in similar ways, where that border creates that segregation that causes this distinction between groups. And people that are really close to the border, and this when you look at their politics, really care about that border. And you get further away, they kind of keep caring about it, and you have to get really far before they stop, because that's such a big outgroup out there. So it's all a big mess. And you and I should work together and figure out how to get a distinct theory around it, the theory of distance. I think it'd be a good thing to do, but I don't know exactly the answer.
Hey, I'm going to go back to your boss and train right. I guess my question would be, when you bring in the African American and the Hispanic onto the platform, and the community sees that out there, how does it correspond if that black or Hispanic person is well dressed, suited up, knowing that person could be have a very nice home, and compared to just maybe being casual dress, and how would they react to that person or that ethnic group, and would they look at it as, do I need to increase my social wealth to be with that person, or are they looking at it as a negative because they're now into their community? Yeah. So I guess that would be one of my questions. Then another question I have is the way society is now with commercials. You see a lot of commercials now where there's interracial activity, black woman with a white man, or vice versa. Or you see now where more men look like running the home. How does that affect society, and how will it affect society in the long run if they continue to run those type of commercials to interact throughout society?
Yeah, those are great questions. Let me deal with the first one first, because I have a more concrete answer for it. So one thing is, this is a point of clarification. In this particular experiment, it was only Latino Confederates. There were no African Americans involved in it. Confederates being the experimental word for the people that work for you in the experiment. Funny word, that's what you use. So anyway, so the people that work for me in the experiment were Latinos. I think it would be really interesting to do it with other groups, and this is something I think would be a very important extension to this experiment. I'm looking at how people react to other groups, but I haven't done that yet. And so, how does it affect how they're dressed? And this is a big, in the immigration literature, this is a big question. Is would it, for example, would people be threatened if people were really dressed up and they thought they were going to go take their jobs? Because they weren't all. A lot of these suburbs that I was in were rather wealthy suburbs, and the people that were the subjects in this experiment were rather wealthy. Maybe they'd be more threatened by somebody that was really dressed up to come take their job. There's some evidence that I think is fairly persuasive in literature that that's not really why people care about immigration. It's not that people think, especially high-skilled people, that people are going to take their job. Is that they just have some sort of base threat. Some people say it's a cultural threat. To me, it's something even more base where we just have this reaction against the outgroup. That's what I would call a cognitive threat. In this particular case, I get a question a lot about how were these Confederates dressed, and we didn't give them instructions about how to dress at all, actually, so they kind of chose to wear whatever they wanted to wear. And if you go to these train platforms in the Boston area, you see that people dress in a whole bunch of different ways. There's people all the way from going in from doing sort of what looks like they're going to be doing manual labor to people who look like they're going to be working in the financial district of Boston and wearing their three-piece suit. These guys were somewhere in the middle. They were wearing polo shirts usually and like jeans or something like that, and looked a lot like other people in terms of their dress on the platform. One thing we did, which I think is interesting and speaks to this, is I took photographs of all these Confederates and I put them up online for a survey and compared them to faces of other people that I thought kind of looked like people their age. So groups of Anglos and groups of other Latinos, and I asked them about their characteristics. I asked these survey subjects about their characteristics, and one thing that's very striking is that the characteristics, the ratings of these Confederates by these survey subjects made them look like desirable people. People said they were friendly looking, they were intelligent looking, they said they were attractive, things like that on a number of characteristics. And so people might want in their neighborhood. Yet, they also said that they looked like foreigners, and they said they looked like immigrants. And it seems to be when they came to their neighborhood, that is what caused people to react. And so in some ways, my answer for a lot of these things is it probably doesn't even matter that much how they're dressed. It seems to be this base reaction that because race is such a dominant paradigm and immigration status is such a dominant paradigm. The thing about interracial couples on TV and interracial interactions on TV is really interesting. I don't know the answer to that, but there's different. I'll give you two perspectives. So one is that it seems like we've been seeing certain ideals of race on popular entertainment for a long time in the United States. And we're still in the same place we are racially. That might be a place that's better than we were like 40 years ago, but in some ways we haven't made as much progress as we really like. And in some ways maybe this popular entertainment isn't making as much progress as we want to. At the same time, there's a lot of reasons to believe from a lot of great work in political science and other social sciences that these messages from what we might call elites, these messages from popular entertainment, things like that, they have an effect on people. They send cues that we think are important, that okay, it's okay to have this racial mixing, that this is something that I should be used to, and maybe it will change people's attitudes. And if you believe this is something that actually has increased, which I think would be an interesting thing to study, then maybe this is something that will have a long-term impact.
Yes, time for one more very quick question.
So Ryan, Dan Hopkins' book just came out about the increasingly United States. There's been a bunch of other work suggesting that there's an awful lot of there's increasing consistency in people's political behavior, particularly along partisan lines. Just on Rachel Morshaw, I think, had another paper showing ways that voters become a lot more consistent. How does that work? How do your two works engage on that point? And you've been focusing a lot on how local effects cause more variance. How does it engage with Dan's work?
Well, so Dan claims, and I never follow up on this, he claims they're very consistent with each other. So maybe we should ask him, because I like that explanation. But I think that the explanation I give, and I don't know if this is Dan's, is that we could, what he's talking about is he's talking about the fact that we see people, for example, with not much things like ticket splitting between their state voting and their national voting. We see increasingly ideological consistency across national lines and things like that. And a lot of the behaviors that I focus on in my book are these localized behaviors that translate into votes for things like these nationalized parties, right? And so it could be that we see people reacting in a way that they're reacting to a localized population in a certain way that shoves them one direction or another. In my case, when it comes to these outgroups, they get shoved to the right and they start voting in might be a more ethnocentric way. Well, because in the United States, you only have two parties, and because of the electoral rules that Dave's actually talking about, we'll talk about later, you're shoved towards one, you have to vote for one party. It seems like that local experience shoves you towards a national party that's becoming increasingly uniform. We can imagine a situation where we had more national parties, we might get shoved towards a different national party, but they're still shoved towards sort of this national party.
Okay, please thank Dean, Ryan, and Nick for the session. We have about 10-minute break, and we'll call you back shortly. Restrooms are downstairs, if anyone needs them.
What their political views are. And you can also calculate for specific measure. Proximity with. It was just about your sure. And what distance is that?
Yeah, good. You need there's always a question whether you have to location, so you need like, with Catalyst, for example, it's suggestion that we can have their exact address. So it's a good suggestion. I work with voter files. Then we have to connect those to like ideological variables. Yeah, thanks.
I thought Catalyst had it itself some sort of like ideological.
They do. Well, whether it's fine-grained enough, there's a lot of people relying on information from the file, whether it's fine-grained enough, we don't when those kind of effects
There's a Stanford sociologist named Brandon right now who does sort of more sophisticated measures of segregation than just the disparity index. And some of those are sort of distance variant measures.
So I'm actually, Sean here. So I have we're using voter files to try to do some of those comparisons right now because we have, they always sort of fantasize about it, they write it down and they fantasize about it because they don't have good data. They want to think about race and they only have like census data. And so with voter files, we have partisanship and race too. So we're using these to try to calculate nationwide disease. And then what we're thinking about is you're looking at connecting those to ideology.
Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. I said hi.
I know, and I see my name.
No, it's all right.
So I'm handing out releases for everyone. So just so we have permission to show your image.
Yeah, sure.
This is going to be for the Center for the Study of Race and Politics and Culture, but there are some times where the University Archive will want to have the video as well. So
this center, is it which departments?
it's not attached to the department.
Oh, really?
So it's a dean reported kind of institute. So very similar to like the Institute of Politics or the Center for Inclusion. It serves all the community.
So at the law school, I'm at the law school. I haven't had much contact with this. I do a lot of work on voting rights.
In the department. Sure.
Maybe they work try to organize I feel like this is a topic of a lot of interest. Or maybe a couple of other things.
And they have fantastic programs.
That's the claim,
So what's influence really interesting?
That'd be a really good idea. Because there's several people at law school.
Why not? Well, we might. So this means, there's lots of things that the claim is that, like, use segregation.
Actually hacking when you like
imagine two sports teams show up and one is all one race and one is all another race, that might drive people apart, right? My claim is that, and it's sort of intuitive, it makes sense to me, that this one of the really important attributes of words psychology that we use to organize the world is geography. So, because the spatial location is so important once upon a time for survival, that's one of the main ways. And that kind of makes sense to me, like, right? Like, for our mind privileges geography over other types of things, and so the clearest signal of spatial location is that's a hard thing to prove, but but you can see it. Sometimes you have measures of other types of segregation, like in surveys, and residential segregation.
everyone who's involved with the conference today is Awesome. All right, well, then we enjoy our today or hang out, come back, whatever you need to do.
Yeah, I'll probably be in and out for the course of the day.
Awesome.
Okay, everyone, please be seated. We're going to go ahead and keep moving here. We have a lot of great content to get through here. Our next speaker is Dave Hopkins from Boston College. As I mentioned earlier, Calvin will be moderating. I'll turn it over to you gentlemen now. Thank you so much.
So I'm happy to be here with Dave Hopkins from Boston College. A quick roadmap of how we're going to try and exercise the next hour. One of the challenges of this format is that not everyone has read the book, so I'm going to try and give you a list of the contributions and arguments, and hopefully that's enough for thanks. Hopefully that's enough for you guys to have something to bite off in the Q&A. I'll get the ball rolling with the 10,000-foot question after this. David Hopkins is Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston College, where he's been since 2010. He's the author, of course, of Red Fighting Blue, How Geography and Electoral Rules Polarize American Politics. Shortly before that, with Matt Grossman, Asymmetric Politics, Ideological Republicans and Group Interest Democrats. Also worth your time. And a textbook that's now in its 14th edition, started by the late Nelson Polsby and Aaron Wadowski, called Presidential Elections, Strategies and Structures of American Politics. His analysis of American politics appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vox, and he blogs about American politics at honestgraph.com. Well worth the bookmark. I think there's three, and it's safe to say there's at least three contributions that Red Fighting Blue makes. First, it moves us beyond the Fiorina of Ramowitz debate, which was increasingly nearing its expiration date, vis-a-vis advancing our collective knowledge about the causes of polarization. Second, Red Fighting Blue's historically sensitive and institutional account of polarization, shifting our focus to political geography and electoral institutions, makes a compelling case that behaviorists and public opinion scholars need to understand changes in American political geography, political parties, and electoral institutions as crucial intermediary mechanisms that translate imperfectly the preferences of the American electorate. In short, the pith is this: because of these geographic and institutional factors, small shifts in opinion can lead to large shifts in outcomes. And third, it is a book that is generative of new research questions for American political scientists of any methodological stripe. We'll circle back to some of these right before we open it up for Q&A. So, in sum, I would submit that one cannot understand the current state of American politics without coming to terms with the arguments in Red Fighting Blue. It is a book that's beneficial to scholars, accessible to an educated lay audience, and should be read by political practitioners and professionals alike. So let's quickly unpack these contributions. A short synopsis of the Fiorina of Ramowitz debate. On Fiorina's account, the mass public is ideologically purple, not blue or red, and it is ideologically polarized politicians and activists who have outpaced the electorate. Thus, Fiorina rejects the culture war thesis as far outstripping the actual level of division in the electorate. Abramowitz, on the other hand, focusing on what he calls the engaged or active citizenry, roughly 35% of the population, sees a world where Democratic and Republican elected officials are responding to those citizens who are most vocal and active in politics. And it is these citizens that are deeply polarized. Red Fighting Blue moves us past this impasse. Hopkins shows why each account is partially correct and their collective blind spot. Both Fiorina and Abramowitz paid little attention to the critical intermediary role that our electoral laws and institutions play. For example, the Electoral College, state representation in the Senate, first past the post allocation rules, and so on. Indeed, many of these departures from pure democratic majoritarianism are enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. So consider how this approach changes the calculus. We move from looking at polarization as seen in individual voters versus polarization seen through the lens of political geography and institutions. That is, once we institutional factors and political geography, the red and blue states vocabulary that emerged from the 2000 election is more accurate than not. Moreover, and perhaps most importantly, through this lens, we see the contours of a new party system that emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Now, to bracket this real quick, this is not Hopkins trying to resurrect the critical realignments theory, and so don't worry about that. If you read David Mayhew.
Yes, if Mayhew was here, please.
So there are four markers of this new party system: resurgent party loyalty in the electorate, closely balanced national electoral competitions, growing polarization and negative partisanship by elected officials and candidates, and a durable and secular geographic divide where the South and Interior West are reliably red and the Northeast and Coastal West are reliably blue. But this regional divide, Hopkins argues, was not an inevitable development. The layering of social issues on top of the long-standing economic divide of the late 80s and early 90s is crucial to this period. Quote, social issues have exerted a disproportionate impact on the collective alignment of states and regions due to their significant spatial variation across geographic borders. In other words, while economic issues have not lost their salience, cultural and social issues have created conflict extension, to use Jeff Lehman's term. While we might not have a full-on culture war, we certainly at the very least have a culture skirmish. And because of the increased salience of social and cultural issues, in this new party system, the GOP has been able to consistently compete, often successfully, since this late 80s, early 90s time period, for control of the House and the Senate for the first time since the 1920s. Finally, the geographic clustering of Democratic voters in large metropolitan areas and the preference of rural voters for Republicans has led to a geographic divide within some states and turned the Midwest with its significant small-town vote into an electoral battlefield. This is a generative book, as I noted before. By focusing on polarization through a new lens, new research questions that we might not have thought to ask or didn't even know to ask appear. For those interested in periodization schema, Hopkins identifies the crucial period of 1988 to 1996 when cultural issues sharply increased in electoral salience. This defies the expectations of most extant periodization schema. For those interested in polarization over time, and those who argue that the U.S. party system is simply returning to its usual state of high polarization, Hopkins demonstrates, again, that the layering of social issues on top of economic issues might cause one to wonder where exactly the next cross-cutting linkage will come from and how it manifests. For those interested in race and politics, Hopkins' account raises interesting questions about the interaction of racial conservatism and liberalism in the swift rise and salience of the cultural issues in the late 1980s and early 1990s. These are simply the low-hanging fruit the book produces. So if you haven't, I encourage you to read it. And before turning it all to the audience, I want to get the ball rolling by asking Dave one 10,000-foot question. So you caution at the end of the book that we should reconsider monocausal explanations of polarization and exercise humility regarding large-scale institutional forms. But I'm going to put you on the spot. What proposed solution in tamping down polarization do you find most promising?
A good question and a difficult one. The book is not really that prescriptive about what to do, and in fact, I don't even see polarization as all bad. there are benefits. There are some problems polarization solves that were like inter-party factionalism that were problems in previous eras. So I don't know if I have any particular strong view. I am persuaded to some extent by my grad school friend Lee Drutman, who has written about how instituting multi-member districts with a proportional representation system might ameliorate some of the polarizing trend. And at the very least, it would expand the geographic constituencies of the parties. And it would certainly expand the scope of electoral competition in this country, which is now getting squeezed into about a third or less of the country, while everybody else is sort of safely on the sidelines on one team or the other in current elections. So I do think that probably would do something. But I'm not someone who thinks, oh, you just tinker with this little piece of the system and everything falls right into place. Unless we start talking about fundamental changes to our constitutional structure, I think a lot of what we have experienced in the recent past in terms of polarization is difficult to dislodge. It's not a problem that goes away if you make some little change like let independents vote in primaries. These sort of proposed reforms often, I think, are not really at the scale of what the problem really is. I'm taken, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, I'm taken very much with the fact that if you look at previous eras when sort of people are writing about party politics in this country, and they're sort of talking about, often it's about what's wrong with the parties and what's wrong with our politics. For example, the Schadenschneider report in 1950, of course, famously, the parties aren't responsible enough, right? The problem is with our politics is that the majority is not unified enough to rule, to put forward a coherent program, and then to institute it once they're in office. And this is a huge problem, and it leads to gridlock. And then about 25 years later, when you get into the 70s and 80s, by then the problem, in terms of conventional wisdom, the problem with the American party system is the parties are too weak. And voters are now voting on the basis of the personalities of the candidates, or who has the clever advertising campaign, or who brings back the most support to the district. They're not linking their substantive policy preferences to their choice of candidates, and so there's no mandate in the public for a particular ideological or policy-related set of priorities. And so we end up with divided government, and we end up with gridlock. And today, people say, well, the problem is the parties are too polarized, right? They can't get along, they're too antagonistic, they won't cooperate, and so the problem is gridlock. And so my sense is that we should start thinking about gridlock much more in terms of the constitutional basis of gridlock, and less in terms of the partisan basis of gridlock, because it seems to me it's very difficult to have the parties reach whatever this ideal, different but not too different, sort of ideal state that we've often had in mind when critiquing the parties, and that has often led to previous waves of reforms and reform proposals that sort of suggest that what's wrong is, something about the parties or something about the nomination process, and so we need to tweak these mechanical aspects of the party structure. And so, I think one of the lessons that I got from doing this work was to let the parties off the hook a little bit and to look elsewhere in terms of the institutional bases of polarization. And whenever you talk about polarization, because none of us really like it that much, sort of who do you blame? Who's responsible for this? And one lesson I think we could draw from history is if we don't want polarization, voters could vote for moderates. That's a solution. That's what the solution was 50 years ago. polarized because voters were voting and electing moderates, and so the voters weren't polarized. So in some ways, we can talk about reform, but reform, of course, is very difficult, and constitutional reform is extremely difficult. I'm not saying it's easier to convince voters to vote for moderates, but it might be sort of the easiest solution, is to sort of try to convince people that there are things more important than simply party loyalty, and that rewarding incumbent office holders or candidates for taking moderate positions is in fact in some ways the clearest path towards reversing some of these trends.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'm going to pepper Dave with inside baseball questions from someone who's available to us.
Yeah, one question I have is, will the Electoral College continue to exist? Or is there to where the popular vote will replace it?
A great question, and one of the points that I make in the book is that we've had the Electoral College, of course, for a long time, but it's particularly important these days because we have close elections and we have geographically polarized parties. And so if you look at the way campaigns were run 50 years ago, when most of the states were battleground states and candidates traveled all over the country and advertised nationally and ran sort of more national campaigns, we still had the Electoral College. The institution didn't change, but because so many more states were open to voting for either party, we didn't really notice the Electoral College that much. And because we often had elections that were sufficiently decisive that there was no real question about there being a split between the popular vote and the electoral vote, well, the fact that we technically elected the president via the Electoral College and not by popular vote didn't sort of end up making too much of a difference. Now, of course, we're in this current era where we have very close elections, we have geographically polarized presidents. We've seen twice in the last 5 elections, the Electoral College can really matter. And so, on the one hand, you might say, well, that makes reform more likely because, people are upset that the popular vote winner doesn't win, and a lot fewer people live in states that are contested actively by the candidates today than they used to. I mean, in any given election now, it's 10 or 12 states are the battlegrounds and everybody else is on the sidelines. But I'm still not sure that that's enough to actually get, to get reform over the line. One problem is obviously the fact that the small states think the Electoral College helps them and they, are going to be protective of what they see as their interests. Another thing, of course, both of the splits that we've had have gone the same way in terms of the party winning, and so Republicans think, the Electoral College is great for us, and so why would we want to get rid of it? It's worked to our advantage, twice in recent memory. So I guess the only way I would see it happening is either the Democrats capture enough state legislatures to pass this popular vote compact, where if a majority of states with a majority of electors, the winner, you can sort of circumvent the need for a constitutional amendment. But again, that's a cause that only Democrats seem to be interested in. If you notice, the states that have passed that compact are all blue states. The red states aren't interested, and the purple states aren't interested. So I'm not sure they'll ever get to 270 there. Or if the Democrats started winning presidential elections while losing the popular vote, then maybe the Republicans would get more interested in electoral college reform. If we reeled off a few elections in a row that went in the opposite direction, then maybe there'd be some more bipartisan spirit for making a change. But I don't tend to be too bullish on the probability of reform. There's a lot of sort of both political and institutional barriers, it seems to me.
what about this role of intra-party polarization? So, red versus blue, you really have, in parentheses, Trump versus never Trumpers versus, parentheses, mainstream Hillary Democrats versus, the Bernie faction. How do you see this fitting into polarization? Because it's very regionalized now, too. Just look at California with, Feinstein facing opposition on the left, and then you see Mitt Romney facing a challenge in, primary challenge in Utah from someone who's going to the right. How does this figure in?
That's a great question. In historical terms, especially on the Democratic side, the factionalism doesn't seem to be running as super deep. It is there, but compared to how the Democrats were 50 years ago, I'm actually they're doing all right in terms of factionalism. But it does bring up a great point about what happens when you have so many states that are safe in general elections. And one, I think, very natural implication of that is some of the energy starts going into, fighting or trying to exert influence within the dominant party. And so the fact, for example, you mentioned Feinstein in California. Well, if California were still a purple state, as it was 25 years ago, probably a lot of Democrats in California would say something like, well, maybe Dianne Feinstein is not quite my ideal politician, maybe I don't agree with her about everything, but she's the kind of candidate who helps win the general election, and so it's to our advantage to sort of unify behind her and not subject her to any kind of ideological purity test. Whereas today, because no one thinks the Republicans have a shot in California, then that may help fuel people within the party to push the party to be more ideologically pure. On the Republican side, of course, we've had cases where even in battleground states, there's been, the Tea Party has imposed purity in 2010, winning a primary over a moderate candidate who would have probably won in the general election, but he lost the Republican primary, and so the Democrats won. And that's happened. It happened in Nevada. It happened in Colorado, arguably. So that's been a problem that Republicans have had to deal with, even within the remaining purple states. Has been, does the factionalism within the party actually, then impact your chances in the general election? But even for the Democrats, I think you see this with the debate about where the Democratic Party should go from here. A lot of the remaining Democratic elected officials and activists live in places where Democrats are going to win probably, year in and year out, and there's not as much talk about how do we appeal beyond the base as you might expect. If there were more states in play, I think that would be more part of the conversation. And this is particularly critical for Democrats because the Senate is sort of stacked against them in terms of the apportionment of the Senate. And so you have these remaining moderate Democrats, the Joe Manchins and Claire McCaskills and Heidi Heitkamps of the world, who are absolutely critical to the Democrats retaining or having any shot at competing nationally for the Senate. They have to win in these types of states. But the party in general is not always talking about how do we reach out to moderates in red states. There's a lot of discussion that's really between two sets of people who live in blue states about where should the party go. It seems to me that might end up being also sort of counterproductive to the party nationally because many of the people who are at the table are not representing potentially competitive constituencies in the way that was true in previous decades.
I'm going to be selfish for a second and ask you one more question. I really do think that it's terribly interesting, the new party system that you identified, and with the layering of the cultural issues on top of economic issues. You give a number of different plausible explanations, and this is why this is a generative book, because Hopkins does not say, well, this is the answer. But if you could talk a little bit more about why you think this particular period was one where all of a sudden we see this big uptick in the salience of these social issues that we really hadn't seen before, and it seems to be sticking around.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the funny thing about when Bill Clinton ran for president in '92, the main rationale for his candidacy was that the Democrats needed to move back to the center. They lost 3 presidential elections in a row by landslides. They needed to be too liberal, especially too liberal on social issues, and they needed to move back to the center. And there was also a geographic rationale, which was that the conventional wisdom at the time was the Democrats can't win without the South. They lost the South in the presidential vote in every election except for '76 when they ran Jimmy Carter. And so the clear solution was run another Southern moderate, you'll bring the South back, and you'll bring back sort of the social conservative or social moderate voters who had defected to Republicans. And Clinton obviously won. He won twice. He left office a popular president, but he was not a socially moderating figure. In fact, he was associated with polarization on social issues during that era. And so, you know, the rationale for why him as opposed to someone else turned out to be sort of wrong. And it's a good question about why at that time, and why Clinton, why did Clinton inspire polarization on social issues in our party system, I think there's probably a couple of answers to that. I think one is that Clinton himself and Hillary Clinton sort of represented a certain social liberalism, or personified a certain social liberalism that overcame the fact that he, on policy, was trying to move the party back to the center. Another part of it was that at that time, abortion, it just became a super salient issue in the early 90s because there were a couple of Supreme Court cases, and there was a real question about whether Roe v. Wade was going to get overturned, and it came fairly close to being overturned. And so you see it in the data that there's a sort of a jump in salience of abortion as an issue just around the time that Clinton winds up on the scene. And of course, on that issue, he is not really trying to attack to the center. He's in the midst of the Democratic Party on that issue. He's not trying to question that. The other thing that happens during that time is to campaign. The Republicans can't run on the economy and they can't run on taxes because you've had an economic recession, and George Bush Sr., after saying "read my lips," signs a tax increase. So they need another message. And the message, the number one message of the Republicans in '92 was family values. That was their message. And that was especially a message that was crafted to attack Clinton. That Clinton didn't stand for family values. And so while we can maybe look now and suggest that there's a certain inevitability once the white South started moving into the Republican Party that we would see the parties divide on issues like abortion, the timing that we see and sort of abrupt appearance of those social issues as partisan issues in the 90s, I think is somewhat contingent on the actual political climate of the era. And then it ends up sustaining even after Clinton himself is gone from the scene, and future party candidates on both sides wind up sort of inheriting the same bases of support. And so Clinton's success for the Democratic Party isn't that he brings the South back. He really doesn't, aside from a few states. It's that he brings the suburban North, the socially liberal suburban North, that had also defected to Republicans after 1964, comes back into the Democratic Party, and so we see sort of in proto form the red state, blue state divide appear in '92, and certainly there by 2000. And again, that's there's sort of a push and pull. The Democrats can't bring the white South back, but they can bring the white-collar, socially liberal suburbanites back, and And so that's when we see California, New Jersey, and Illinois, and all these sort of states now becoming safe blue states for the first time.
I have a question about issues of representation. So we're talking about partisanship without representation, which I think is odd. And it concerns me a little bit because of the idea of the moderate and the center, right? As though these are static categories, right, that don't move around. So what you have to say about I'm not sure, I haven't read the book, so I don't know what characterizes the new party system, but I wonder if you think that we might be able to bring that sort of shaking up on the basis of representation, right? Like perhaps the center, right? People are trying actively now to move what constitutes the center. And different kinds of electoral strategies are being tested. So for example, I have in mind what Stacey Abrams and her team is doing in Georgia right now, in absolutely rejecting this idea of moving to the center in order to win elections, but instead trying to activate, the nearly half of eligible voters who don't vote, right, by perhaps representing them.
So when you say representation, excuse me, sorry, this clarification, you mean sort of like social group, identity, that sort of thing?
Social group, identity, but also policy issues, right? Like, so if we talk about the center and moderates, like we act as though there's a static category of issues that people are concerned about, whereas it might be the case that there are a whole, it absolutely is the case, right? That there's a whole category of issues that are never talked about, that people really care about, and perhaps that's part of the reason why they're disengaged. And then you layer on top of that identity and social group stuff, but I'm worried that this conversation is too narrow.
It's a great question. The Democratic, many of the sort of Democratic national politicians, I think, have been, if you sort of think of their experience of the past generation, it's been an experience of vulnerability, of electoral vulnerability, of having, sort of everything being great around 1965, having control of both the presidency and Congress, and sort of shedding support. And I think that has had a really strong impact on the mentality of candidates, of consultants, of people in position to sort of develop strategy for the Democratic Party in particular. And a lot of it has been about, winning back the people we lost, as opposed to trying to find people who maybe are out of the process and bringing them in. And maybe that's impossible in some cases. And maybe at some point the conventional wisdom shifts. But someone has to show that you can do that. If Stacey Abrams shows she can do it, I think that would have a real significant impact on the thinking of the conventional wisdom within the Democratic Party that's been formed by a whole generation of people who were traumatized by George McGovern and Walter Mondale losing, 49 states. And so that's what we may see, depending on the success of these alternative approaches. At the same time, one point I think is important to make is that the geography of the country really matters in terms of thinking about these, these sorts of issues. And so the fact that Democrats have to win states like West Virginia to win the Senate, maybe they don't have to worry in the presidential election, but in terms of Congress, that they have to win in these places where they used to run well but have been weakening, I think also is going to affect their strategy and their mentality. And maybe in the future, a state like Georgia will be a state that will be in play for the party, and then they don't have to worry so much about the Midwest and the problems they've been having in the Midwest. But this is where the integration or the interaction of geography and institutions becomes really important. It doesn't really make any difference if you go from 36% to 46%, but it makes a lot of difference if you can go from 49 to 51. And so that means that for thinking about which states are in play and which districts are in play, you have to focus on the places where you think you can be sort of pushed over the edge, and that drives a lot of this, this mentality. And so that leaves a lot of people out, right? Because a lot of people live in states that are not 51-49, they're 55-45, or they're 60-40. And so, but, what incentive do the parties have to mobilize people in those states or try to change things in those states if they don't think they can get to 51%? And so I think a lot of what you're talking about is very true, but it's to some extent itself a product of the strategic imperatives that the institutions place on the strategies of the leaders.
Yeah, so I think I'm picking up a little bit on the thread that we were just having about representation, but for me, these conversations about polarization often feel very white, in the sense that it sounds like we're thinking about the predilections of white voters, right? So we're thinking about the Democratic Party needing to sort of woo some of these white voters back into the party. And so, one, I want to know if this sentence is right, that when we talk about polarization, we're really thinking about the behaviors of white people. Black people are pretty loyal, black voters of the Democratic Party, and so is this really a conversation about white voters? Is that sense right? And if so, sort of, where do we place blacks and other racial minorities who are more loyal to the Democratic Party, and we aren't thinking really about them moving around? Where do we place them in the conversation about polarization?
Yeah, that's a great question. The political geography of this country in some ways works against African Americans. In terms of presidential elections, many African Americans live either in states that are already safely blue, like California, New York, Illinois, or they live in states that are already safely red, like a lot of the Deep South. And so the states that are the purple states, there are some of them like obviously Ohio, Florida, that do have significant African American populations, and of course it's critical to mobilize them and to persuade them, if you're a Democratic candidate, to carry those states. But in general, the African American vote is not ideally distributed in terms of the geography of the country, and it's even worse in the Senate. It's even worse for the Senate than it is for president. We always focus on presidential elections, but the Senate is especially sort of stacked against African Americans. There's no single state where African Americans are the majority of the vote, and there are a lot of states where, again, they're not, the battleground states are not the states with large African American populations. And then when it comes to the House, again, because of geographic sorting and clustering of racial groups combined with the Voting Rights Act, you wind up with most African American voters living in districts that are safely Democratic districts. And so they're not the swing districts, and they're not the districts that are facing a pivotal race between the parties in general elections. And so while the increasing diversity of the country in general is something that people have often sort of seen as something that's sort of a help for the Democrats, because these are for the most part loyally Democratic voters, and there are more of them than there used to be, and the white share of the country is declining, and this might mean in the future an advantage for the Democratic Party. Once you start breaking it down into the nuts and bolts of who lives where, and where the votes most influential, where the power of the vote largest and smallest, it's a much more complicated picture. And And so that's, you know, that's, I think, part of the reality of why the parties have often not prioritized mobilization of that, or persuasion of the African American votes is simply because they're sort of in the wrong places in the country for the strategy to be maximized.
I was wondering if you could talk about your other book. No, because it's interesting. No, because in the other book you have this idea of asymmetric politics, you know, the Republicans and Democrats having different ideological types of commitments to political styles. And one of the things that comes out, and I think this maybe tapped into the representation question, is to what extent we're not talking about ideology and geography. And it's easy to understand how parties utilize geography strategically and how that begins to, you know, arrange party organizations given systems of representation. But I think implicit in what you're talking about, there's some notion as the parties become more ideologically split in terms of, particularly in terms of their elites. How do we think about ideology and geography as it relates to these issues of representation? So why are we seeing ideological consistency or ideological patterns in terms of geography in ways that perhaps didn't exist 50 years ago? Or do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of the clear developments is simply sort of ideological sorting. That when we go back 50 years ago, one of the main reasons why the parties weren't as polarized was you had a lot of conservative Democrats. And why did you have a lot of conservative Democrats there? Mostly from the South. And why did you have moderate Republicans? You had moderate Republicans who were mostly from the Northeast and to some extent from the Coastal West and people from the Midwest. And so the ideological differentiation across regions is something that's been true for a long time, but it didn't always matter in terms of the partisan alignments. And there used to sort of be a sort of a very strong belief that the parties could adapt, that sort of the genius of the American system was that the parties could adapt to the local context. And so you could have different flavors of Democrats running in different parts of the country, and different flavors of Republicans. And they could sort of, pitch themselves to whatever the local electorate preferred. And that might cause problems once you aggregate up into Congress and you've got a bunch of different kinds of people all with the same party label. But that it at least meant that there was competition, sort of wide competition and different kinds of representation within each party. And some people sort of saw that as the sort of natural state of the American parties. There's a lot of writing, in the 1940s and 50s sort of about that, especially sort of people who were responding to Schadenschneider. This is sort of the genius of the American system is the ability of the parties to be so open and to adapt to ideological or other variation that you would have across electoral constituencies. And what we see now is that the ability of the parties to do that is really getting constrained. And that part of this is that voters seem to be using their votes for local candidates as a proxy vote for national leaders. And so, if you were a Southern voter, you might have said, well, I like, Mary Landrieu, okay, or Mark Pryor, they're moderate Democrats, they're sort of in line with what I think about politics, but if I vote for them, I'm also voting for Barack Obama and Harry Reid, and I don't like them. And especially now that control of Congress is so contested from one election to another, it's really easy for the other side to make an argument that, gee, you may like Scott Brown, for example, in Massachusetts, who was very popular, but lost because people said, well, I like Scott Brown, but I don't like Mitch McConnell, and so I'm going to vote for Elizabeth Warren. And so to me, part of what's really changed is the behavior of the electorate in tying whatever its existing ideological preferences are to its partisanship and then also to its loyalty to a particular party over another. And with respect to asymmetric politics, I do think that maybe somewhat more of a change on the Republican side. The Democrats have had a bigger moderate bloc all along, and they still do today. But if they can't sustain that moderate bloc in Congress, again, it's more difficult for them to win a national majority. So, yeah, I do think that's been a big change that really is fueling a lot of the the divisions that we see today in politics.
So in thinking about this polarization and this era of polarization we live in, I wonder how you compare this maybe to something else I've been thinking about lately, another polarization in American life in the late 19th century, which is also where we saw close party competition in Congress, 2 out of some number of elections where the Electoral College winner didn't win the popular vote, and then sort of culminating that era in the election of 1896, which is a very clear sort of break from that into a new era of dominance of one particular party. How do you think this era compares to that period?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't profess to be an expert on 19th century politics, and so I'm humble about drawing historical parallels too easily, but it makes a lot of sense to me. And it's of course helpful to remember that the relatively depolarized era of the 1940s, 50s, 60s was not sort of necessarily the norm in America, to which our current era is an exception, but we can somehow, and we're trying to just find our way back to the norm. And quite possibly maybe the other way around. The fact that many of our great works in political science and texts and pioneering studies were performed during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, sort of ended up maybe accidentally setting that as kind of the baseline textbook story of American politics, to which these new novel developments are these sort of these mutations from. And it seems to me the more we think about the 19th century, maybe the more we can think about maybe this is more the norm. Certainly regional differences, strong regional differences. I know enough about the 19th century to say they had those then. In fact, I think there was a war fought along regional lines. And so the idea of a nationalized, so-called nationalized parties that could compete across all 50 states was something that maybe really was only true for a very small part of American history, and yet many of us in the back of our minds say, well, that's what we want, let's see if we can get back to that. And so I do think that that's an important thing to remember as we discuss polarization and partisanship and regional differentiation, is that we've been through that before, and it lasted for an awful long time, and it often had very, very significant consequences.
Last question. Someone had a hand up.
So I have to say that this polarization, I was a little bit disheartened when you said that you hope that Stacey Abrams win, because if she doesn't, I'm inferring here that there would not be support for that type of work. And I see an opportunity here for us to do that type of work in that region, maybe in a Southerner and social justice organizer. It's not just going to happen. We have to work at it. So when you stated and you said that you saw layering of social issues, I thought you were like going to an era of Reagan, 80s, communities, deinstitutionalization of institutions that have led to economic crisis, specifically in areas of the South, where not only blacks but whites, and reactions to that, making it easier to feed into ideologies and things of that nature. I didn't read your book, but I'm wondering, is there some type of connection to that, or is that where you were going with that?
It's great. No, I think there's more to say about the roots of social, sort of the appeal of social issues that was along the lines of what you said, and sort of wasn't able to cover all of that in the book, but I think it's a great point. There's one thing I'll say that has struck me more since writing the book does depend on making this distinction between economic and social issues, and we can see in the data, in the way people's public opinion line up, that there's a validity to that. There's a validity to the idea that people may think one set of things about what the government should do about health care and taxes and so forth, and another set of things about what the government should do about abortion and gay rights and so forth. But I also think that you can take it too far in making that distinction, and that these things can become related. I'm thinking about Kathy Kramer's great book about Wisconsin, about rural people in Wisconsin, and how often the people she talks to make connections between issues that we might think of as economic, like healthcare, and issues we might think of social, like religion or race or immigration. And we are sometimes guilty of artificially imposing these distinctions on a mass electorate that thinks about politics in a very different way than many of us as political scientists think about politics. And so I think, go forward, my own thinking, I think, is becoming more along the lines of being a little skeptical about making such hard and fast distinctions between different sets of policy issues, because I think one of the things we're seeing today in our politics has been the ways in which these things connect up, and they become connected in the minds of voters. And I think figuring out how we deal with that methodologically and how we deal with that theoretically, I think is going to be a challenge for all of us studying American politics today.
Okay, thank you. Please join me in. We're going to move right into our next panel with Clayton Hall and Anthony Fowler. Obviously, Clayton is seeing what Anthony's done, some people's research. I'm just kidding.
It's going to be a very grand entrance with this.
So I'll wait for Clayton. Oh, he's here. Really quickly, I actually have the scenario co-op here in the afternoon. So during lunch, around 12:30 and until about 2 o'clock, they're going to sit at the table in the back. So they'll be able to purchase some of those that we're talking about today, as well as make some pre-orders, some orders for ones that you're interested in being sent to you if you're interested in stuff we're talking about today. So that's going to happen during lunch, so hang around, and also about till 2 o'clock. So right around this time, we have our next set of panels.
Okay. I'm glad the chairs are angled. Much better setup.
All right, it's worth the wait, Clayton. I am Anthony Fowler. I'm an assistant professor here at the Harris School in Chicago.
I'm really happy to be here with Clayton All, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. Clayton got his PhD at Harvard in the Political Science Department, where we overlapped for a few years and got to know each other very well. I'm a big fan of your work. I really enjoyed reading the book. The book is called The Road to Inequality, How the Federal Highway Program Polarized America and Undermined Cities. Just came out in the last couple months. I was eager to read it anyway, and I'm really happy that I had the excuse to do so for this conference. So Clayton, I thought I would just ask you to start. Tell us a little about yourself. Tell us how you got into political science and how you got into highways. Why are you interested in federal highways?
So thanks, Anthony, for discussing, and I want to also thank the organizers for having me out for this conference. It's been a great day so far. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the talks. So, my interest in highways, I think, originates. I grew up, I think, much as a lot of Ryan's work is influenced by his time in Chicago. My work was really influenced by growing up around Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is one of the most polarized metropolitan areas in the country, one of the most racially segregated metropolitan areas in the country. I grew up in Sheboygan, which is about 50 miles north of Milwaukee. And the extent of polarization between the central city of Milwaukee and its outlying areas, its suburbs, was really evident to me as I got involved in politics, really evident on the evening news. And it was also clear to me, driving into Milwaukee on I-43 and driving in and out of Milwaukee on I-94, how much of our social and political life is organized along interstate highways. And it's something that has been fairly neglected in political science. To the extent that we talk about we have talked about highways in the political science literature, it's often been strictly in terms of distributive politics, who gets work. But it actually, highways are very evidently a social policy as well. And so so looking at these two elements, the fact that our metropolitan areas are so polarized, that highways seem to have played a big role in facilitating how metropolitan areas form, especially in the post-war period, motivated me to work on this book.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. So a big part of the book is about the political effects that interstate highways have had since the 1950s. Tell us a little about that. What are the political effects they've had, and what's some of the evidence for those effects?
Sure. So first of all, I think why study? If we're going to look at something like metropolitan polarization, why study highways versus any number of other causes? And in writing the book, I didn't want to argue that there aren't any other causes of polarization of metropolitan areas. There definitely are. But highways are useful in one respect, in that the interstate highway system, if you actually look at how interstate highways were assigned, where they were built, they're plausibly exogenous. That is, where they were placed didn't necessarily have a lot to do with local influence. It was heavily determined by transportation planning needs. So when these highways were put in, they facilitated many of the phenomena that we're going to be talking about today. They facilitated white flight. They facilitated not just white flight, but sorting of particular whites who had particular residential preferences for living in certain areas of the suburbs. So in the first empirical chapter of the book, I talk a little bit about this, using a mix of historical and contemporary evidence to look at how changes in travel time, changes in travel speed would affect where people would choose to and be able to live. And so in this chapter, I talk about highways as facilitating kind of two roles, and I use two metaphors in this chapter. One is that highways are a catalyst. So it's not like people wouldn't have been inclined to move to the suburbs or weren't already moving to the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s. It's that highways facilitated this transition, facilitated their migration out into suburban areas. And using some present-day experimental evidence, I look at just how much does this trade-off between travel time and preference for other aspects of one's neighborhood actually play, affect where you're likely to choose to live. So one thing is that it's a catalyst. The other thing is that highways, or I think more generally, the car-oriented, highway-based transportation system that the vast majority of Americans use to get around, that this acted as a filter. So a lot of poor urban residents either don't have or choose not to have cars. or they're dependent upon transit to get around. Those folks, in addition to being excluded from the suburbs for a whole range of other reasons rooted in policy and discriminatory practices, are also excluded from the suburbs. In the process, both of these factors, the fact that highways are catalyzing these existing sorting tendencies and filtering people out of life in the suburbs, it facilitates the eventual growth of Republican suburbs versus Democratic cities.
Yeah, you show some very compelling evidence that indeed this kind of polarization, this geographic polarization we're familiar with Republican suburbs and Democratic inner cities, was largely the result of interstate highways, which is really fascinating. And you also show that...
I think partly a result of it. I'm not claiming that they explain some X percentage of the variance, but they contributed to it, yeah.
And you also do some work and show that it's not that people are sorting because of their party per se. Right.
That's right.
So what's going on? How is it that the suburbs are a bit more Republican and cities are a bit more Democratic, even though people seem to don't express some preference of living next to people from the same party?
Yeah, that's right. So I think in talking about residential sorting and in the early versions of this work, I think I probably left people with the impression that I was arguing that something along the lines of sort of big sort, like a hard version of the big sort argument. For those of you who know Bill Bishop's work, that like somehow Republicans and Democrats just have these very different preferences, and that they actually want to live around people like them. I think that does actually play into this a little bit in terms of the sort of maybe cultural amenities or cultural aspects of living in certain places in the present day. There's a lot of evidence that maybe people don't really act on that. But if you look at partisan differences in attitudes towards who do they want to have as their neighbors? What are their racial preferences around who they'd like to see in their neighborhoods? What are their preferences over density? We can go back to survey results back in the 1970s, 1960s, and we see even then, before the parties had ideologically sorted out as much as they have today, but there were still 10, 15-point margins in how much Democrats and Republicans preferred whether or not to live in a city. Okay, so there's generally an anti-urban preference among Republicans. So all of these things together, I show in this second chapter, fed into the suburbs attracting more people who were at the time Republican, or perhaps were likely to become Republican based on its preferences.
And you show this really nice empirical work, and you see that indeed, as these highways are getting rolled out, you see geographic polarization. Suburbs become more Republican, the cities are becoming more Democratic. The effects are modest in a lot of cities. There's a lot of variation across metropolitan areas. In some places, these effects are modest. In some places, these effects are big. One of the first factors we explore is that the effects are a lot bigger in southern cities. And then you go on to show that what's really going on, where you get these huge differences, is in fast-growing cities. And so you think of around Phoenix and Houston and Dallas and Atlanta. Maybe you can rattle them off better than I can. But a lot of the action is happening in these places. And I wonder, we're used to thinking about geographic polarization in terms of people from the city moving out to the suburbs, but actually it's new people moving into these cities that weren't there before. I don't know, are they coming from rural areas, are they coming from other cities? But a lot of the action might actually be new people, maybe from rural areas, who are moving into the suburbs of Houston, who previously had thought about living in the city. And that's an interesting thing. So.
Yes, I think it is. And so I think in setting up this kind of moving into a discussion of the third chapter of the book, which is also a JOP, borrows heavily from the JOP article on the job market paper. So that third chapter shows that there is this heterogeneity in these effects. And, thinking about how I pursue this project, I think one way of thinking about this is, one thing I'm doing is I'm leveraging the differences across metropolitan areas and where highways are built. So you might think another way that we could think about these interventions is actually like try to imagine the United States without interstate highways. I think overall the effects might be a lot bigger and uniformly a lot bigger if we thought about the problem in those terms rather than exploiting the variation across metro areas. But having exploited that variation, the fast growth, and particularly in the Sun Belt and in some areas outside the Sun Belt, but these fast-growing cities We see what's called greenfield development. Is brand new housing tracts going up outside of these cities, attracting people who prefer that particular cluster or basket of amenities. I think a lot of these areas are more likely to be conservative voters and movement in a conservative movement.
I also think one reaction I had is that I think we, the people who live in cities, academics and so forth,
right.
we tend to think of these two Americas, and we most of the people we know are liberals and Democrats, and we think that out in the suburbs everyone is a Republican, and that's not exactly right, actually. So there aren't too many neighborhoods in the United States that are predominantly one-party neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. We just happen to live in them here. But in fact, if you went out to kind of what we think of as the white Republican suburbs, they're actually only, a lot of them are 60% Republicans.
That's right.
So that's an interesting phenomenon as well that maybe we don't fully appreciate. How does
so that's I think that asymmetry is something that I wish I had. In starting the project, I think I had a strong set of priors that I think were maybe informed by that point of view. When I first, I was working on the first drafts of this project, and I really updated it as I worked on subsequent drafts. And I think that asymmetry is important. I think but it's still important to note that as a result of these extremely democratic cities that have a set of policy preferences and policy needs that are really at odds with those 55% Republican suburbs, that the gap between the two still matters pretty tremendously. So, in the book, I focus a lot on the broad differences between the central city and outlying areas. That said, I think it does speak to, maybe moving on to talking about some of the results later in the book, thinking about what are the implications of polarization. And to what, just how severe is it? I think, but the gap between central cities and their outlying areas is really important for public policy in deciding what kinds of goods are allocated, public goods are allocated across metropolitan areas. The fact that you do have these 55% Republican suburbs means that their preferences overall, the preferences of the median voter, are going to be much more conservative than those in the central city. And that matters. But I think one thing I was expecting to find, or was considering exploring early on in the project, was this idea of echo chambers. And I think the Big Sword, this book, The Big Sword, really influenced me thinking about this. That people are moving into these really polarized areas, or they're just surrounded by people who are like them. And my thinking has really changed over the last few years on that question. I don't think so. Polarization matters, but doesn't matter for this kind of isolated enclave politics that we're all so concerned about. Probably not.
So let's talk about some of those other political implications. So one obvious political implication is that for state legislators and for the House of Representatives, we elect people from single-member districts for the most part. And when you draw a single-member district, this kind of geographic sorting has huge implications for the seats votes curve and everything. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Think about that.
So I think I'm not the only person working on urban-suburban polarization right now. My next-door neighbor at Stanford, Jonathan Rodin's been doing some really terrific work on what does all this urban-suburban polarization mean. And so I think one of the implications of the polarization that I talk about in the book is that there is a natural bias, a natural gerrymandering of sorts that occurs that disadvantages cities when congressional district lines are being drawn. And so that's been the subject of some recent Supreme Court cases. But there's also a fair amount of contrary evidence when it comes to actually what's actually happening in our state legislatures or in Congress regarding what happens when people are sorted out along these lines, and it's that geographic polarization the cause of this secular growth in legislative polarization. And there's a fair amount of evidence that it's maybe not mattering all that much. That actually what's happening is in a lot of swing districts you see really extreme members being elected by one base or the other, depending on where the median voter happens to shift in any particular year. But what I do in the rest of the book is I actually look at how does this polarization shape metropolitan policy. My motivation for writing this book was really driven by what's happening in these metropolitan areas that are polarized, and how are important political decisions being made across these metropolitan areas, and transportation is one of those areas.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So it's almost, the book makes a bit of a switch. The first part of the book is about the effect of highways on a political geography and kind of the broad implications for the political system. The second part of the book is about the actual politics of highways and transportation, which is also incredibly fascinating, and it made me think Clayton's just really interested in highways and wants to tackle them from all different angles, although I know that wasn't exactly how you thought of it. But tell us about that.
I hope tenure letter writers don't just write that.
Why is transportation policy a particularly interesting area to see the effects of something?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a question that I've asked myself often while writing this book. But I do want to say, so I think transportation is important, and the reason I latched onto this topic, the metropolitan transportation, is that it's I think really an archetypal example of policies that are decided across metropolitan areas. I think there might be a few other examples of this, perhaps education, perhaps things like water and sewer and electricity and those other infrastructure things, but it's one of the few examples of cases where, actually, in one of the later chapters I write about this, federal law actually requires that a lot of transportation decisions have to be made, or advisory decisions need to be made at the metropolitan level through these metropolitan planning organizations. It's also been, if you go back and read some of the literature on suburbanization and some of the new suburban history, there are all these examples that get brought up again and again about things like, say, Atlanta, which is how the Atlanta example is how I start off the book. In Atlanta, there was this proposal to build MARTA into a bunch of the suburban counties, and many of them voted not to, a few of those counties voted not to be included in that transportation system. So when the suburbs are saying we have an ideological opposition to providing certain types of transportation or certain types of transportation policy that will benefit the central city in our area, and our basis for doing that is motivated in large part by our partisan-rooted ideology, that there are important decisions being made about the nature of opportunity in metropolitan areas that are being affected by transportation policy. Yeah.
So this is a conference about polarization, but highways is actually one of the issues that, at least for a long period of American history, was really was not polarized at all. People love highways, right? So what's happened over time? And there's obviously this interesting thing where there used to be, there historically have been Democrats representing suburban rural places, Republicans representing urban places. That's shifted over time, and that presumably is having and will have some interesting implications for transportation policy. Because, as you said, highways are largely a benefit to suburban and rural people. Public transit is largely a benefit for people in urban areas. How is that playing out now?
So in the fourth chapter of the book, and this is maybe where there might have been a little bit too abrupt a transition, but I wanted to actually get at this question of okay, so Democrats and Republicans are living in different places. That really only matters if that's somehow affecting people's lives. And how does that actually translate into different policy attitudes? How does that actually translate into different policy outcomes in metro areas? So the first thing I did is I wanted to understand, okay, so Democrats and Republicans are moving into different places. Do they have different attitudes, or are they developing different attitudes as they've been doing this story? So I went into the Roper Archives, which is this, for those of you who aren't political scientists, this historical database of just about every survey that's ever been conducted by Roper and Gallup, going back to the 1920s and 1930s, I think, the surveys made. And I found every question that was ever asked about highways or public transportation. And the data are a little limited, but found that Democrats and Republicans, back in the early 70s, at the height of the Arab oil embargo crisis, they agreed in equal proportions that more money should be spent on mass transportation. They also agreed on the need to spend money on highways. Now, while support for highways has remained relatively bipartisan, regardless of where people live, I think this kind of contradicts a lot of the I don't want to call it folk wisdom, but if you read, say, a lot of the new suburban history, starting with Kenneth Jackson's classic book, Progress Frontier, there's sort of this implied feedback argument, which is that the suburbs suburbanize, and the people in those places develop some set of attitudes that are suburban and reflect these interests. In reality, what we're seeing is much more ideological divide around some of these questions. So, regardless of whether you live in the suburbs or in the city, I think there's actually pretty broad support for spending money on highways. But we're seeing that Republicans have been increasingly less supportive of transit or any alternative to highways, particularly those that might benefit urban residents, might benefit poorer people. And so in the rest of the chapter, it's kind of hard to use all this historical data to get down into this question, because there weren't really specific types of questions asked about different types of transportation policy. So in the second part of that chapter, I dig in by asking a bunch of more detailed questions about different types of transportation priorities. And when we force people to make trade-offs, so we do these pairwise tests where we ask people, give people two choices. Do you support spending money on bus service to low-income housing projects, or on repairing suburban highways? And you can order people's preferences when you force them to make a choice. And when you do, you see that the more different types of transportation policy look like welfare, the much more polarized the two parties are. And so you see a really big partisan gap in that respect. And these are actually the battlegrounds around which a lot of urban-suburban transportation fights are occurring, right? Yeah.
And you do some really fascinating extensions about what's going on inside Congress.
Yeah.
And there aren't that many roll call votes taken on transportation issues. So you, I think, come up with a pretty clever solution from a researcher standpoint to that problem, which is you look at the introduction of bills, even bills that maybe go nowhere, and maybe the new was going nowhere, but they're doing a little bit of grandstanding. So tell us a little about that research.
Yeah, so I think, again, going back to this idea that polarization is, in political science, a lot of research on polarization has looked at Congress and polarization and roll call voting. And you might think, with Democrats living in cities being represented by Democrats in Congress, Republicans moving out to the suburbs and rural areas being represented by Republicans, that you might see the two parties polarizing in Congress on these transportation issues just as they are within metropolitan areas. And this is where I think really the crux of polarization comes into play, which is that people can be polarized, and institutions can either exacerbate that polarization and accentuate the results, as I think some of David's work has shown, or they can actually mitigate or completely offset a lot of that polarization. So what we've seen, if you look at in Congress, a lot of, even as Congress has changed control from unified Republican, unified Democrat, there have been very few changes to the transportation policy regime. So ever since the 1970s, when there was this deal struck, which is sometimes called the 80-20 rule, which is that 20% of the transportation trust fund money goes to, or the highway bill money goes to transit every year. There's basically been this log roll that's been very persistent. And a pretty strong bias towards the status quo. Even when Trump came in, I don't know if you guys remember, he was going to have Infrastructure Week. And Infrastructure Week was going to be this massive overhaul of our transportation policy. Well, basically Congress just went back and reapproved exactly the same, more or less the same 80-20 deal that it's been doing since the 1970s. So where does this matter then? It matters if you go down to the local level where federal law has actually delegated a lot of decisions about where to locate transportation projects, where to spend the money on transportation projects to state highway departments, state transportation departments, and these metropolitan planning organizations, which for a number of reasons are actually biased against cities in a number of ways. And particularly when they're dominated by suburban Republicans versus suburban Democrats, I think we can expect to see that much less money is going to be spent on central cities and transportation needs.
We heard from Ryan earlier this morning that where you live might have big impacts on your political attitudes and political behaviors. I know that's not entirely the topic of your book, but do you have thoughts on this or evidence on this? Or we know that highways are changing where people live, and they're changing the distribution of partisans in those places. Does that have any interesting downstream consequences about how people think about the other party and how they actually politically behave? Or do we not know? Is that another question?
Yeah, and as I was sitting through Ryan's excellent discussion this morning, I was thinking a lot about some of its implications for my work and that I might not have considered while working on the book. And I think this idea that like you see this in a lot of really interesting little ways, like this sort of Tashville and Turner, or actually called the Tashville-Turner Enos thesis about this formation of identity based on place. Like you ever notice like how Hannity's his logo is like an interstate highway logo. But there's a little subliminal messaging which is that we conservatives are our identity is that we're these suburban and rural people, and as opposed to the city people. And I think that as this kind of sorting does occur, it may not be a real echo chamber effect, but I think this idea of and Kathy Kramer's work has also shown some of this idea that suburbanites and particularly suburban conservatives are seeing themselves in opposition to cities. We certainly have seen this in these activist drafting platforms of the Republican Party over the last few years, where they've gone from in the 1970s the Nixon platforms with it was a law and order racialized law and order platform, but it was all about how we solve the problems of cities, right? Going from that to the Democrats just want to shower money on cities and using social engineering, and we don't want to do any of that. That's basically what the last few Republican platforms have said. So I think there is this. Now the question is, does this actually have some sort of contextual effect? Like the question you're getting at. I'm always hesitant to argue for contextual effects unless I feel really confident that they're well identified. And I think a lot of Ryan's experimental work does a great job of that. But I do think we may see some sort of socialization, which may occur through this spatialized approach. I think we also see in things like at a metropolitan level, you turn on the evening news and it bleeds coverage of all the bad things happening in the central city. You live in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, or Waukesha, Wisconsin, and you see that Milwaukee is this place that is mired in disorder, and whether or not you're there, the fact that you are out in the suburbs and enjoying these amenities and protection from these urban problems may very well entrench some of these ideological tendencies. Yeah.
How does race factor into all of this? We've talked a little bit about race just now. The book touches upon it, but the book is not explicitly about race, and you discussed this a little bit at the end.
Yeah.
But to what extent should we think about this sort of geographic polarization and its implications as partisan versus racial versus some other dimension?
Yeah. So I think any time you deal with a question like dealing with the question of partisanship, trying to partial out partisanship from all the other things that are highly correlated with partisanship is a fool's errand. And I'm trying not to do that in the book. And I think one of these, I also didn't want to make the book exclusively about race and white flight for a number of reasons. One, and I think Tom Gorzalek's book, Cities on a Hill, which just came out, talks a lot about how actually there is an urban coalition which is composed of whites and minorities, an urban liberal coalition. In the research in the early part of the book, I show that actually there was white flight, but it was flight of particular types of whites out into the suburbs, not a universal phenomenon. And so I think focusing on partisanship is, I think, I made this choice for a number of reasons. One of which is that it's clear that it's the basis around which a lot of people make a lot of their kind of ideological and intellectual decisions. There's a lot. We're seeing growing ideological consistency, which matters a lot in relation to geographic polarization. And I think we can simultaneously talk about how race is central to the story, while still emphasizing that partisan geography matters quite a lot.
I'm going to ask you a little bit of an oddball question, but would you like to make any predictions about the future? So we have not had we have not had really a major transportation revolution in the United States since the interstate highways.
That's right.
In some sense, we still, for the most part, travel the way we did back then. there's a chance, and we don't know exactly what those odds are, you have to comment on that, but there's a chance that we will experience a serious revolution in the next 15, 20, 30 years in the form of self-driving cars, in the form of high-speed rail, hyperloops where people can go 750 miles an hour and commute hundreds of miles in just minutes. Suppose that happens at a widespread level. You could imagine now this creates a real opportunity for people to geographically sort even more. You could now live on a ranch in Wyoming and commute to Denver in 10 minutes.
Right.
So what do you think would happen in a world where that's a possibility?
It's fascinating to think about the Hyperloop idea. I think a lot of the mechanisms that I discussed in the book would play out at a larger scale if that actually happened. I think you might very well see this kind of sorting on residential preferences spreading out into larger scale areas. Already you see this to a certain extent in the preferences. That's like in the Bay Area, our housing is so expensive that you'll actually see registered nurses who work in hospitals commuting in on Southwest flights from Boise or Montana each week. But the ones who are choosing to do that are choosing to do that on the basis of some other set of preferences they have about where to live. They could very well choose to live in a more dilapidated neighborhood on the San Francisco Peninsula with a smaller home and other kinds of housing. So I think we're likely to see people making those kinds of choices to a greater extent. We're going to see a huge revolution in transportation speeds, I think, in the next few decades. And whether we make a lot of the same kinds of mistakes that we made in the first transportation revolution or the post-war transportation revolution, I think is something that we'll have to engage with in our politics.
All right, let's open up for questions.
So I'm thinking about, so I live in Syracuse, and we have an interstate that literally cuts right through the city, and there's public housing underneath it in case you need another symbol of what the impact of highways is. But it is coming to the end of its lifespan, as a lot of the highways in this country are, and the community is having a discussion about what to do with it. And so there's an opportunity here to actually pull down parts of the highway that go through the city and open it up and allow people, and one of the things is that you could make a tunnel, or you could make it so that people just have to drive through the city. And so I can imagine this is the same kind of thing that's happening all over the country with these aging highways. And if there's an opportunity in different places to change the structure of the conversation, in part just because these highways are getting older.
Yes. Yeah, it's a fascinating question. It's one that I actually have a new paper, which is kind of it's like a Be Real paper from the book. It's like the cutting room floor stuff. But there's actually a lot of new stuff in it. It's looking at places like Syracuse. When you put these highways through cities, what do they do down at this local level to neighborhoods? And they did cause massive damage. Often in neighborhoods that were already in decline or being subjected to other discriminatory practices like urban renewal. I think cities are going to have to grapple with whether they want to invest the capital in doing things like the Big Dig, which topped out at something like $20 billion. I don't know what the final cost overrun was on that, but it was huge. Or basically go back to the way they were in the early 50s. If they did do that, it would be kind of ironic. I think, for removing certain types of highways, that would be pretty ironic. If you go back to the early 50s and look at what the U.S. Congress and mayors was saying about the need for interstate highways, the urban mayors were the ones who were advocating for highways, including this guy Ben West, who was, if you know the history of Baker v. Carr, was actually one of a racially moderate to liberal mayor in Nashville. These were one of the people who were most eagerly advocating for building more highways in cities to address cities' horrible congestion problems in the post-war period. So figuring out how best to address these issues, like do you turn highways into boulevards, is a great question. Shannon, when you think about Syracuse, Akron actually removed a highway if you haven't done that experience with their Vanderbilt, because they have a highway that's split between African American neighborhoods. So I don't know if that's in the conversation in Syracuse, but you may see cities doing that. My question though deals with suburbs trying to diversify, at least not economically, but broaden their tax base by having these, mixed density developments. Yeah. We see it in Milwaukee, Oak Creek, or even like places like Denver, where you're trying to attract clearly millennials who may be more liberal. What do you see the future of that? And that actually may backfire in these conservative suburbs because it changes the voting calculus in these areas.
Building density, building more urban style housing is going to actually change the composition of the electorate. Yeah, and so I've had some interesting discussions with Jonathan Roden on this question. He's actually looking at some cases where there's almost a smoking gun that in certain places, the electoral calculus actually has led parties to want to build workers' housing in certain districts versus others for exactly the reason that you outlined. I think this is, my next project is broadly about housing, and I think, if you look at these highly polarized metropolitan areas, many of them are, there's a combination of highways kind of facilitated this sorting, but the catalyst interacted with these discriminatory and restrictive policies that were in place in the suburbs. If you look at, you can draw a map of the Milwaukee area, a blue-red map, and it's also, you can also draw the black-white map of Milwaukee. There's basically at the Milwaukee County line, there's just this drop off where you see almost no multifamily housing of any kind being built in these surrounding counties. So I think it does actually matter a lot to the changing composition of the population and of the community when there is this kind of restricted housing policy. Right.
So Clay, this is a fascinating discussion. It follows well on the last question, I think, which is one of the things I find most interesting in that you're showing is that these preferences, even predating means to move, existed for different types of dwelling environments and such as this correlated partisanship. And so my question is, why does that exist? Why does that these preferences exist? I know you might not know, but I'm asking for speculation. And part of it, of course, could just be race, that people have different racial attitudes. But I'm wondering if you think there's anything more to it besides that.
Yeah, so some analyses that ended up in the appendix of my JOP paper and sorting, I address some of these questions. There's a after if you look just say at white Democrats, white Democrats still have a preference for living in more urban places and more racially diverse places than white Republicans who are almost overwhelmingly white in the survey sample. I think this does speak to a broader set of questions about, when partisans, other than just having sort of Michigan school, partisanship as a social identity, is there some sort of preference for urban policy, or urban collective goods, or urban public goods, or urban amenities that differs between the two parties? Is there something about support for order or disorder, or perception of order or disorder that influence Democrats and Republicans differently? I don't know if I have a clear answer to that. I suspect there's a combination of a Michigan school story and an ideological story there. Yeah. I think.
So it's quite persuasive that when the highways were constructed 50 years ago, they contributed to the partisan and racial segregation of metropolitan areas. What's interesting now, 50 years later, is that the highways are still there, going to the same suburbs they were going to 50 years ago. But in a lot of metropolitan areas, those suburbs, at least the inner suburbs, are a lot more politically diverse, or a lot more racially diverse than they were in the 1960s and 1950s. It's true in Chicago, it's true in DC, it's true in LA, it's true in Baltimore. It might not be true in the South and the Southwest as much, but it is largely true in the major cities in the Northeast, the Midwest, maybe the Pacific Coast. And so I wonder what should we make of that? Are the political and the racial effects of highways waning over time? Was there a sort of period maximum contribution segregation years ago that's no longer as intense today?
Yeah, I mean, so you see this in the data, you see this big shift in partisanship. It coincides with the partisan realignment, but it occurring across this period, this earlier period, but then that shift is either remained the same, particularly in the South, or it's diminished a little bit over time. I think the overall mechanism that I discussed in the book, which is that highways are this catalyst, can be expected to play out and interact with the changing environment in metropolitan areas, and very well may offset some of the worst aspects of urban-suburban polarization. So if you look at places like Riverside in California, for example, it's a place that has gone from being a very white conservative suburban, ex-urban area to a quite racially diverse and purple area. And highways provide some mobility to do that. So it may very well be that highways will also, or the infrastructure that we have in our metropolitan areas will facilitate this shift away from polarization.
Clayton, can you talk to me about a little bit more about how the sorting you see sort of with the birth of the highway system increasing over time, and sort of as the sort of densification and urbanization of the suburbs is happening, and some of these metro areas seem to be thinking of themselves sort of as truly as like metro areas, like in Denver, for instance, and how the council of governments is super active in there. Work there. So as these metro areas, in some places at least, seem to be working together as more of a unit, even if there's still some sort of sorting within that metro area. Can you? How does that play out when you think about sort of the urban-rural divide and Kathy Kramer's work? And Q came out a couple days ago with a big study about how rural residents think everyone hates them, urban residents think everyone hates them.
I need to actually read that.
So how does this all play out with sort of maybe the highways enabled this sorting back 60 years ago that is sort of continues to play out, but it's kind of maybe reaching this equilibrium to some extent. And now there's this other bigger.
Yeah. So I guess your first question is really maybe about how do we create metropolitan institutions to somehow integrate all these groups that are potentially polarized on partisan and policy dimensions. I'm skeptical that metropolitan institutions are going to save us from this. And I think what very well might happen is if you do, and I actually talked about this in the last empirical chapter of the book. So back, I see lunch has arrived, so I don't want to take people from that, so I'll make the answer short. So 1991, Daniel Petra Moynihan, also pushed through this provision to give these metropolitan planning organizations much more power, and with the well-intentioned idea that by forcing states to address metropolitan needs, that they're going to address the overall welfare of metropolitan areas much better when they're doing transportation planning. What happened in practice in a lot of places is that the suburbs, well, first of all, these MPOs don't have a one-person, one-vote policy. So, a tiny suburb gets one vote, and a big city gets one vote in a lot of these. So there's some exceptions, but it's very biased against cities. And it's not clear if you do create united metropolitan areas that the median voter, the pivotal city in these organizations is actually going to be interested in serving urban interests. It may very well be a suburban voter, and the preferences of that suburban voter might be much more conservative than what the city would want. So I think cities often talk about the need to bring the whole metro area together, and I guess my thoughts on that are be careful what you wish for. Yeah.
So there's one thing that hasn't been mentioned in all this, which is one thing that highways did is allow land development, and basically the incorporation of land development and the provision of public services, specifically public education, to become highly differentiated. Yes. And we saw this in this great polarization between kind of cities and suburbs. As a lot of suburbs now are though beginning to urbanize, so you're seeing a lot more economic activity in a lot of suburbs. And cities are gentrifying or recalibrating. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that changes this dynamic of public service provision, specifically public education, since that factors so largely into all of this kind of sorting calculus. And if you have any further thoughts on that?
I think the differentiation of public education, the quality of public education, which is I think is often a proxy in people's minds when they're moving, is a proxy for the composition of the students of the school district. I think people think a lot about peer effects and not just how resourced the schools are. That is really important. With suburban districts diversifying, I think what we're seeing is that there are certain inner districts that are diversifying a lot. I think it's largely driven by aging housing stock transitioning into being sold to people moving in from the inner city or or immigrants moving into these inner suburban areas with aging housing stock. I think what we're seeing is maybe a spatial expansion of the urban diversity out into the suburbs. I think that for those who are most conservative and may respond most negatively to that diversification, we are seeing additional sorting out into outlying areas. And I think you see this in places like the Inland Empire, where folks who could very well choose to live in more diverse areas in Orange County or LA are choosing instead to have a large house out in a more homogeneous area. I think it's going to replicate a lot of what's happened before, perhaps just on a different spatial scale.
You have one more question? Time for one more? We can have lunch.
Not a loaded question.
That is a leading question.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for going easy on me. Yeah, that was actually really great Q&A. Thank you.
I think we might need a new battery in this.
Thanks so much for really was.
I can't promise it's a positive story.
whether or not they're going to be still married or divorced, they're divorced, how these things can that'll in their country and discuss.
Well, I mean, my favorite is like other
So I mean, like that may work when your kid's like 5 months old, but that's, you know, your kids go to soccer. Yeah, you know.
great question.